coming as well. And I know Commissioner Baines unfortunately couldn't be here, but I think this type of engagement is so important, and hearing from folks in this room and people online is critical for all of the work that we do at the BPU. So I'm really excited that we're all here today. So today marks the beginning of one of the most consequential regulatory reviews New Jersey has undertaken in a generation. And it comes at a moment when families and businesses across our state are feeling real pressure from rising electric bills. New Jersey residents, small businesses, local governments, advocates, and community organizations all want to know why costs keep rising and what can be done to stabilize bills over the long term. They want to know whether the structure of the system is still working for them and whether the incentives built into that system are aligned with affordability. That's why we're here today. Governor Sherrill's Executive Order 1 directs the BPU to evaluate the century-old utility business model that underpins how electric distribution companies earn revenue and how those costs ultimately show up on customer bills. This proceeding asks the fundamental question: does the current model still serve New Jersey ratepayers, or is it time to build something better? Let me start by briefly explaining the framework we are operating under today. New Jersey's electric utilities use a traditional cost of service model. Under this structure, utilities recover their operating expenses and earn a regulated return on capital investments that are deemed prudent and used and useful. In practice, that means the primary way utilities increase earnings is by increasing their rate base, the value of long-lived infrastructure such as poles, wires, substations, and other capital assets. This model has served the state for decades, but it also creates a structural incentive to favor capital-intensive solutions even when lower cost non-wires or demand-side alternatives may be available. It requires frequent, expensive, and antiquated rate case processes, and it does not directly reward utilities for improving performance, reducing long-term costs, integrating distribution energy resources, or delivering measurable customer outcomes. So let me take a moment to speak plainly about why reform is needed and why it is needed now. Over the past decade, electric delivery charges in New Jersey have risen steadily. Some utilities have filed multiple rate cases in just a few years. And while each case has its own drivers, the pattern is unmistakable. The cost of maintaining and upgrading the grid is increasing, and the current regulatory framework pushes those costs onto customers through higher rates. At the same time, the grid itself is changing. We're seeing more rooftop solar, more storage, more electrification of vehicles and buildings, and more extreme weather events that stress the system. These trends require smarter planning, better performance, and more flexible tools than the traditional model was designed to provide. Under the current model, utilities earn more when they build more, but customers benefit most when utilities invest wisely, operate efficiently, and pursue the least cost solutions, whether their solutions are wires, software, demand response, or distributed resources. That misalignment is what this proceeding is designed to examine. And we're not alone in this work. States across the country, like Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, Colorado, and others, are rethinking the traditional model and exploring performance-based regulation, multi-year rate plans, and new approaches to utility earnings. Some are further along, others are just beginning, but the trend is clear. Regulators everywhere are confronting the same pressures we face here in New Jersey. Let me briefly define performance-based regulation, or PBR, because it will be central to today's discussion. PBR is a regulatory approach that ties a portion of utility revenues to measurable outcomes, such as affordability, reliability, interconnection speed, customer service, or cost control, rather than solely to capital investment. It's not a single policy. It's a toolbox, And part of our work is determining which tools, if any, are right for New Jersey. I also want to acknowledge that not everyone agrees on the best path forward, surprisingly. That's healthy. Reform of this scale should invite scrutiny. We may not all agree on the tools, but I believe we share the same goals: affordability, reliability, and a grid that works for New Jersey. This process is built on transparency, collaboration, and robust stakeholder engagement. And we welcome all viewpoints as we work through these questions together. Your perspectives are essential. We cannot build a modern, affordable regulatory framework without the people it is meant to serve. Let me walk through now how we're going to spend our time today. First, we'll hear from Elizabeth Knoll, Senior Strategist for Energy in the Office of Governor Mikey Sherrill. Elizabeth will outline Executive Order Number 1 and the specific requirements laid out, the foundation for this entire proceeding. Next, NJBPU staff will provide an overview of the scope of the study, the existing rate-making framework, and the key questions we'll be evaluating with the support of our consultant, E3. After that, the Regulatory Assistance Project, who has been tremendously helpful throughout this initiative, will introduce the core concepts behind performance-based regulation. What is, what isn't, and why so many states are exploring it as a tool to improve reliability and grid performance. Then we'll move into one of the most valuable parts of today's agenda: a roundtable with 4 former state commissioners who have led utility business model reform in their own jurisdictions. They bring real-world experience, the successes, the challenges, and the lessons learned. And we're so grateful that they are here today, in person or online, to help us inform New Jersey's path forward. And then finally, we'll transition into facilitated discussion, where we will ask you, stakeholders, advocates, utilities, and members of the public to help identify the outcomes that matter most for New Jersey customers and the regulatory tools that can best support them. This is where transparency, collaboration, and stakeholder input become real. We want to hear what you think, what you've seen, and what you believe will be best to serve New Jersey. Before I close, I want to say a word about what comes next. Following today's session, E3, the BPU's independent consultant, will begin its full onboarding. We will hold additional stakeholder sessions, technical workshops, and opportunities for written comment. We will publish materials, data, and presentations so the public can follow the process. And we will continue to engage openly as we evaluate potential reforms. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for their participation, their attendance today, either in person or online, and their commitment to this dialogue going forward. And I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Knoll, who is here in the virtual world somewhere.
Can you hear me? President, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, great. Okay, so thank you, President Sadovi, for the introduction and the level setting. As you noted, we all know why we're here today. The cost of energy is too high, and people are struggling to afford their energy bills. On day 1, in fact, right in the middle of her inaugural address, Governor Sherrill stopped to sign Executive Order 1 to effectively freeze rates. As part of that, she directed the Board of Public Utilities to undertake a study to modernize the traditional electric distribution utility business model. Significant capital spending will undoubtedly be needed to address the mounting pressures facing our grid going forward. A recent comprehensive study of 51 investor-owned utilities done by Powerlines, a nonprofit organization, found that investor-owned utilities propose to spend at least $1.4 trillion over the next 5 years on capital expenditures, which is a more than 21% increase over just the prior year. But we understand we need to invest in our grid. We want to enable growth and new solutions. Utility companies are entitled to a fair return on their investment, and investors are should get a profit, but that needs to be reasonable and it needs to be balanced with affordability for customers. So this examination by the BPU is to look at the underlying business model and examine regulatory changes that could better align utility earnings with customer outcomes. As stated in the executive order, we're seeking to understand the relationship between the traditional business model and recent trends affecting electricity affordability, and to consider opportunities like making utility revenue models less dependent on capital spending and infrastructure. Also, expansion of performance-based rate making, whereby performance would include, among other things, the rate at which utilities approve the interconnection of new electricity generating facilities to the grid. We're also thinking about least cost resource testing, greater use of asset securitization, and many other things I'm sure we haven't even thought of. We want to lower cost and enable growth. And the good news is, as President Sadovy stated, other states have already begun this exploration. There are states who have put in place new regulatory paradigms that are delivering results for their ratepayers. We have an opportunity to learn from those best practices and build something that works for New Jersey. I'm really, really excited about today. I'm so appreciative of the BPU and President Sadovy for her leadership here. I'm really excited to be able to kick this off and hear from RAP and other experts and really get this going because we don't have time to waste. So with that, I will turn it back over to the room to kick off our proceedings.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for those opening remarks. Thank you so much, President Gul-Sadovy, for kicking us off this morning. Thank you, everyone, for being here bright and early on a Thursday morning to talk about utility business model reform. My name is Josh Ryer. I'm a principal with the Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP, where I lead our work in the Northeast. I'm joined today by Mark LaBelle, who's also a principal who leads our research and strategy group, and you'll hear a little bit more from him. We also have Danny Livingston here, who's a strategy advisor to our CEO and a senior associate on the research and strategy team. And then we also have former Chair Vinostran, who is also a senior advisor. I believe that's your title, correct? Perfect. With RAP as well, among many other roles. Great. Well, again, thank you everyone for being here. There's really three things that we want to achieve today as RAP helps facilitate this conversation. The first is that we want to make sure that we're sharing with this group all of the pertinent information about Executive Order 1, specifically chapter or paragraph 7, that really outlines specifically what this study is going to look at and might inform next steps that come out of the study. We also want to inform this group and really make sure everyone is aware of the best practices related to performance-based regulation and the different mechanisms that can be used to better align the utility business model with public outcomes like Elizabeth and the President talked about earlier, including hearing from, as has been mentioned, 4 former commissioners who have experience with performance-based regulation mechanisms and the different tools regulators have to better align the utility business model in various jurisdictions across the country. And then, of course, perhaps most importantly, we also want to hear from you. We want to make sure that this, and it's been very clear from BPU and working with them on this, that they want to hear your input at the start of this process to make sure that whatever comes out of this study is aligned with the goals and priority customer outcomes that are needed here in New Jersey. Just to reiterate quickly, the agenda that the President went over earlier. So we're doing opening remarks now, obviously. We now have Executive Director Bob Brabston, who's going to go over 3 things. He's going to talk about Executive Order 1 and what's in the scope. We're going to talk about the scope of the study specifically and what we can expect and what you all can expect out of that study. And then we're going to talk about in level set specifically what are the existing regulatory mechanisms here in New Jersey. We heard a little bit about that from the President, but what tools are there for the utilities to recover costs? And how does that relate to some of the performance-based regulation mechanisms that then we'll hear from Mark about, and really better understand and unpack some of the things that we're seeing and best practices that are emerging across the country when it comes to performance-based regulation. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll have that commissioner roundtable that we've been talking about. And then we'll have about an hour of facilitated discussion with this group using, if folks are familiar with Mentimeter, it's a tool, it's a poll tool that will walk through questions using that device so you can get prepared for that. And then we're hoping to be wrapped up around 1 o'clock. Great. All right. So with all of that level setting out of the way, I'm happy to turn it over to Bob Rabson to start talking a little bit more about the executive order, the scope of the study, and the existing regulatory framework here in New Jersey. Bob? Thanks, Josh.
Morning, everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here. I recognize most of the people in the room. And for those of you I haven't met yet, looking forward to getting to say hello at a break. And good morning to everybody online. And thank you for dialing in to this. I don't think the president was overstating the opportunity that we have here and the opportunity that Governor Sherrill has created for us through the issuance of the executive orders 1 and 2. I'm not a big prop person, but I just wanted to share my copies of it, which I keep hanging on a hook next to my standing desk for easy reference. They're in reach just outside of camera range. So it's an easy way to course correct and check what's going on, what we're talking about, and remember where it fits in with what it is that the governor has sketched out for us to do. And it's an ambitious agenda, which we are here for. The BPU has shown over the years that we thrive in this high pressure environment. We have shown that we can perform as the center of attention, and this is an unprecedented opportunity for us, and we're looking forward to it. And Christine, I just want to thank you for your leadership and the support for staff through all of this. It's an exciting time, and you're steering us in the right direction, so thank you. So the executive orders were issued with what I thought was a good flair during the inaugural speech. It was exciting to have that kind of demonstration of commitment to the issues that are so important to us. And it did not fall on deaf ears that the governor made a point of declaring a state of emergency on electricity affordability. Affordability has been President Sadovi's focus for a couple of years. Having that kind of support and emphasis on it right out of the gate is important confirmation that we've been on the right track and that we have the support to do the things that we know we need to do. So, a couple of things that were outlined, and Elizabeth went through a number of these things. And like I said, the executive orders really lay this out for us. Providing the residential bill credits, that's something that we are prepared to do, we're looking to do, and we want to make sure that whatever it is we do, it's sized correctly, it's effective, and it accomplishes the goal that the governor set forth of offsetting any of the generation side increases that are scheduled to hit in 2026, including the use of RGGI funds. Those funds, at least the BPU portion, have long had the ability to be targeted for support of LMI customers. With appropriate adjustments, we may be able to extend the effectiveness of that. We're looking at all the system benefit charges and the budget for the Clean Energy Program. As people are aware, we're updating the Clean Energy Program budget this spring. Budget adjustments are not just for low and moderate income customers. We're looking at affordability for all customers. And as the EO requires, we are looking to at the timing and implementation of any distribution utility rate changes that are proposed to come before us. just to recap for everybody, but please make sure you take a look at the EOs for yourself too. There should not be any surprises about what it is we're trying to do. Um, in this first executive order, the utility business model study is something that we're kicking off today. And we welcome E3, who was awarded the contract approved by Treasury. And I'm going to steal a little bit of their thunder today, but you all will have the opportunity to work with them and their expert team. And I'm really excited to have a firm of that quality coming on for this. I'm not going to read the slides. You all can take a look at that for yourself. And this is really a pretty direct paraphrase from the executive orders. But, as the president said, we're looking at the relationship between utility business model, and we mean that very broadly. It's the way the utilities conduct business. It's the way they recover costs. It's the way customers are charged and pay. And so how does that model affect affordability? What are some of the policy pathways to reduce and stabilize bills? There are a lot of models that have been tried around the country. We plan to look at as many of those as possible. We are not going to just cut and paste, but we are not above that. I am not ashamed to say that I'm not above stealing any great idea. We want to try and do it the best that we can, and we will take any kind of input that we can get on this. Specifically, and as the president said, we're going to be looking at performance-based rate-making measures, things that a lot of us have talked about in more or less detail over the years. And I'm just going to run through some of these here. Again, these are pulled right from the executive order. We want to make sure that we're balancing capital and operating expense. We understand that there's some push and pull there. We want to have a thoughtful conversation about how to make that happen. Interconnection timelines, you've seen a lot of traffic from us on this, both on the demand side and on the generation side. In this case, we're really, we're talking about generation side interconnection timelines. We want to make it fast and easy for generation to connect, all levels of generation to connect to the distribution system, to the transmission system. We want to work with our partners, the EDCs, to make sure that we can do that in a reliable way, do it quickly, and do it without imposing costs on existing customers, if we can help it. Multi-year rate plans. We've all experienced phase-ins and different things like that. We want to take another look at that. We want to take a look at ways to get ahead of some of the things that we've experienced. I'm going to use the word pancaking. I know that's not what the companies really do, but I struggle to describe it in a different way. Coming in for a case and then coming right back in for a case on top of it, because of the way the initial case went. So we want to give you all clarity. We want to give you all predictability. I know from my experience, 15 years in-house at an investor-owned utility, those kinds of things are highly valued. And we want to try and provide that for you all as well. And so that your investors have it and your ratings agencies have it. We've got return on equity on here. We know that's going to be a sensitive topic and get a lot of attention. I'm going to frame it out this way, not prejudging any outcome. We want to make sure that the actual cost of equity and the returns on equity are close. We don't want there to be a significant gap between the cost of equity that you all experience and the returns that the agency awards. So that's really where that conversation is going to head. Supplemental transmission projects with some of my friends in the audience. We've had some of these conversations. We know that at the BPU, we don't have the bandwidth to jump in both feet and examine every single project. But at the same time, the way those projects are currently run, we don't feel like we've got a ton of visibility into those and even less control. We need to have a conversation about those. We need to make it clear that to the customers that those are experiencing the appropriate rigor in their analysis and review. So that's at least where I'm coming from when I think about that one. Again, that's one of the things we're going to have to review here. Least cost resource testing requirements. This one to me really lands as, if we're going to do all of the above, what does all of the above look like? What does it cost? And let's pick the ones that make the most sense, that are most cost effective. So we'll have that as one of the work streams as well. Securitization is on here. Maybe not as many of us in this room have the same PTSD about that, but I was here for the first time we did it in the late 90s. Not eager to repeat the experience, but it's a solution that we have to at least examine if it's appropriate. But again, it's not something that would be done lightly, and I welcome some of the nodding graybeards in the back to catch me at a break. We can commiserate on what it was like to go through that the first time and talk about whether or not it makes any sense this time around. And then finally, whether or not we need to amend our regulations and how do we make that happen in a way that doesn't take 2 years. So, those are things that we're going to try and cover in this study. And the study must be completed by July 19th. So, rocket sled. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. So what is the docket going to look like? How is this going to work? So docket numbers up on the screen. You all surely know what it is. So we will run this like we do any of our other large proceedings. It's going to be run through our case management system, which means documents will be available through the public search tool. And things will get filed, quote unquote, in the docket. Schedules, notices, data requests, and I'm going to come back to that. Other materials will be distributed via the listserv, published on the website, sent to parties directly, any other way we can to facilitate prompt communication, and filed in the docket. And all these things will be made available on a rolling basis unless or until we establish a formal schedule that would dictate when certain things need to hit. With regard to data requests, utilities, be prepared. You're going to get a ton of data requests in the early stages of this. As E3 gets on board and unlimbers, you're going to get a lot of data requests from them, and we will have to work out a reasonable turnaround time for that. Recall the date from the last slide, July 19th, for the initial filing from initial submission from the consultant. So that's what we need to try and hit, and we're going to lean on you guys. So the scope. We've got a couple of phases planned, and the initial phase that we're looking at, well, before we start there, we will have another broad-based stakeholder meeting with the consultant to talk in more detail about the work plan and communicate with more clarity and specificity about the phases and the breakdowns and things like this. So I'm going to talk about it more in generalities, stage setting, give you some ideas of some of the specifics so you can start your internal planning processes. And then when we get together with E3, we'll have them go through in more detail exactly what they're going to be looking at, what they're going to need, what the data requests will look like, and things like that. So phase one, and these are my air quotes, a qualitative alternatives analysis, what's out there. As the president said, as Elizabeth said, as Josh said, we're looking, casting a wide net. So what is out there that we ought to be looking at? What are some good examples? What are some lessons learned, things we want to stay away from? And we want to try and capture all of that. What are some of the trends? What are different states, jurisdictions seeing? Are there regional, national trends? Are there outliers? We want to understand what's going on out in the marketplace in a way with more rigor than anecdotally. Where are these cost trends found on the bill? And I'll come back to this. Generation, transmission, distribution, program cost drivers, others. Taxes is one that is probably not going to be listed anywhere here. That's another one. And what are some of the incentives and drivers of decision-making that are inherent in the current regulatory structures and in the current utility business models, and what should we be doing about some of those, or any of those things that we ought to look at changing. Okay, even better. Thank you again. So phase two, baseline analysis. Data collection and calibration. This is where we're going to be looking for a lot of cooperation, and we're going to help too. We have a lot of this information in our own files, but we want to make sure it's current. We want to make sure it's in a consistent format. We want to make sure that it matches up with what the utilities think is their current data. We're going to need a lot of cooperation from the EDCs on these things, and I list them all here. Some of these things you can start getting together right away. You probably already have a lot of them. So I'll just run through them quickly. Your most recent work papers, your last revenue requirement, cost of service, rate design, cost allocation, all those kinds of things will be important. They're things that we're going to want to look at. Rate design is going to be a key policy tool. And again, we'll come back to that later on. What are your CapEx and investment forecasts, and how far out do they go? And we'll need some categorization of that data, specifically when it comes to investments in the transmission and distribution system. What are the drivers for those investment decisions? What are you accomplishing with those investments? And how are they going to help, and I'll get to this one a little bit later, with the utilization of existing assets? Forecasted sales, load growth assumptions. Those are things we have been talking to you about with especially with the load queue. The generation interconnection queue, you're going to hear about this a lot from us. This features prominently in both of the executive orders as a tool to try and get new resources online that we think are necessary to help with affordability. Grid utilization, this is, I'd like to think we were using it before it became a buzzword, but it's very popular to talk about it right now. For those of you who haven't run into this, really just trying to figure out a way to get more out of the existing assets to spread more sales over a larger sales base, try and bring down costs for existing customers by utilizing fixed assets to a greater extent than they are now. And finally, system performance and reliability data. We're going to want a current snapshot. We're probably going to ask for it with maybe a different focus than we otherwise get from you all. So stay tuned for that. And then we're going to start developing some scenarios for us to study a little bit further. Then as we get to the end of this initial process, and we've got all the data and we're crunching it and running scenarios, we're going to work with the consultant and we're going to solicit some stakeholder feedback on this. What are some of the alternate regulatory constructs, business model constructs we ought to be looking at? What are some scenarios that we ought to model? And what are some of the parameters that we should use for that modeling? And how should we present our findings there? Should it be, I hesitate to say dashboard, but is a dashboard the right kind of approach? Are there other ways we can represent this data visually? For me, I need that. I can't read spreadsheets so well anymore. So I really need to see it, broken out graphically. And I think that will help us all in terms of understanding what it is that we're looking at. And above all, and this is something that staff endeavors to do with all of our work, but in particular here, given the stakes, make sure that we've got a rigorous and transparent analysis of the factors that were laid out in paragraph 7 of Executive Order 1. This is only the first of our stakeholder engagements. There will be others. I envision us coming up with some specific work streams that can be staffed appropriately, that will go on more or less parallel tracks, but we don't have to hold up progress in one area while we're tackling a thorny problem in another. So we're going to try and be efficient not atomize the work, but we want to sort of break it out into logical categories and pursue it on their own paths and then have it all feedback into each other. And then we'll figure out what the right reporting is for all of this. We want to make sure that we're sharing our progress. We want to make sure that the output is something that people understand, they can track, they know how it was built. As others have already said today, we're not going to agree on everything, but everybody should understand where everybody's coming from. And we'll endeavor to make sure that that is how we approach it. And part of this will be, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this aspect of it, but part of this will be looking at how are we doing things now? What parts of that are working? We don't have to blow everything up because we need to make some changes, but we need to understand the current reality. We need to understand how these things work and how changes to these fundamental aspects of your business model, of our regulatory framework, how important they are to your ability, the EDCs I'm talking to here, your ability to attract capital at reasonable rates, to meet your reliability obligations, to serve your customers in the way that the customers have become accustomed at just and reasonable non-discriminatory rates. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we know that there are things that have to change. So we want to make sure that we're thoughtful when we look at the way we're doing things now and where we want to make changes. And we want to, identify all of those things. And a lot of you, and thank you for this, have been very thorough in giving us the list of all the things that are before us or coming before us, with the relative magnitude of those various mechanisms. We understand some of these things are what we call pass-throughs. That sounds more passive maybe sometimes than it is, but things that are outside your control that you're obligated to pay in order to maintain service, thinking, fuel, power, things like that, where like BGS and things like that, where there's not a lot of opportunity for the companies to do anything about that. Other mechanisms are maybe more in the utility control. I'm thinking there more about the infrastructure investment mechanisms, where we can talk about whether or not they're right-sized, whether or not their scopes are appropriate, whether some need to be adjusted or frankly done away with because they've accomplished their intended purpose. So all of those kinds of things are on the table for discussion. And to come back to the pass-through costs, we want to make sure that customers are confident that even for the things that are, technically outside the control of the EDCs, technically outside the jurisdiction of the board, that we have some visibility into what those things are. We're trying to understand where the moderating influences can come into play, even if we can't have direct influence on those kinds of things. What can we do to help limit those costs and not passively accept things with just it's a pass-through? And let's take a look at a customer bill and the components and see what are the areas that we can control. So this is an anonymized breakdown of average residential customer bill, somebody who happens to be executive director at the Board of Public Utilities, and the breakdown of the bill I got last month, and where the relative costs go. And I took the graphic that our comms team put together and I pulled it apart a little bit so I could read it better, just so I could highlight some of the pieces of it. And I mentioned basic generation service down there. There's not a lot we can do about that. I think the BGS auction process does a very good job for the state of New Jersey of hedging year-to-year volatility, but we have baked in 3 big years of market costs. Now that market's not going to change dramatically, but even if it came down, those reductions would not be reflected in customer bills for quite some time, and only gradually. That's the downside of hedging against upside volatility, but that's what a hedge is all about. So that's BGS is a big portion of it. Transmission. This is not a BPU jurisdictional element, but we're looking at over half the bill right there, which is one of those sort of pass-through things outside the direct control of the board. Nevertheless, those are things that we have to look at. Pulled off to the side here, distribution. That's the rate cases. And the other kinds of things come before us. Infrastructure improvement program, IIPs, 4%. So that's 20 to 25% of the bill is where we focus a lot of our time. And then, other elements in here, state clean energy and policy programs, 9%. That's a substantial portion of the bill. That's something we need to look at. Now, as we know, that's societal benefits charge. That's where the ZEC was, Reggie, things like that. So that 9% is not a monolithic piece. That's an aggregated slice of pie there. But a lot of things in that are within our control, and it's our obligation to look at those as well. And everything on here is our obligation to look at, but we have to make sure that we're being thoughtful about the things that we tackle in the near term while we're looking at long-term structural reform. So I don't know how I am on time. I'm probably a little ahead of the schedule, but that's what I wanted to cover this morning. Looking forward to continued dialogue, taking questions at the break or via any of our interactive features. And again, everybody's going to have the opportunity to submit comments, written comments to us on today's proceedings, anything that you've heard today, anything that you want us to be considering right out of the gate. We're not going to wait to read input from everybody. Things come into the docket. We're going to be taking a look at it in real time. So I know you're not shy, so let us know what you're thinking. And again, thanks for being here and thanks for your attention this morning.
Perfect. Well, great. Thank you so much, Bob, for that overview. We want to move next to Mark LaBelle again from RAP, who's going to give us an overview of some of the trends in performance-based regulation, some of the key elements, and then really talk through kind of the foundational components, why we talk about performance-based regulation, and what we think about in general when it comes to utility regulation. What are the core principles of that, and how does PBR build off of that? So that, Mark?
Thank you, Josh. Everyone saw my picture on the slide first. Now they see me, I think, on the camera. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, President Sadovi. Thank you to the whole BPU for their leadership and ultimately Governor Sherrill as well. We're very excited to be here today. So who are we? RAP is now a global nonprofit, but we were founded by former state utility commissioners. And we take working with state utility commissioners to regulate in the public interest as one of our highest missions and to help them innovate and get better results for the public. I've been with RAP for over 7 years now, and one of my areas of focus is electricity rates and utility business model reform. So it's really exciting for me personally to have a state really engaging on these issues that I've been working on for so long. So one of my jobs is to be the annoying history guy. So quickly, I'm going to zoom out a little bit to talk about what this is all about in the big picture. This is a quote from the former chairman of the New York Department of Public Service from 1989. I believe this was a speech he gave to an investor forum at the time. All these issues have been chewed through before is one of the lessons here. Peter Bradford was also the chairman of the Maine Commission too. And he's actually still on the RAP board of directors, believe it or not. He's around. Cost of service regulation, we talk about as the traditional model now, but it actually was created by people in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And it served a bunch of purposes and was an improvement on the previous model, but people have been complaining about it since it was instituted, right? And dealing with its downsides. So I'm going to read this quote very quickly because it's worth dwelling on the challenge. It's the same thing today as it was in 1989. Of course, all regulation is incentive regulation. In this context, the difference between good regulation and bad is that better regulators try to align the incentives so that the best economic results for the customers also produce the best economic results for the stockholders. So this is the challenge. Regulating utility incentives. We need to understand how the baseline utility business model works. This is the metaphor of pushing the boulder. You need to know what the utility, what the slope of the land is and the direction that you want to go. If the ground is flat, it's easier to push the boulder. If you want to go in an uphill direction, you have to apply a lot more force. Understanding the basic physics and the gravity of the situation and what the baseline utility incentives are is a prerequisite for understanding the reforms. The utility rate of return, return on equity, as mentioned by Bob, and the impact of that on shareholder value is part of understanding the basic lay of the land in this boulder metaphor. It's also important to understand qualitative incentives, sort of incentives built into utility culture and how they are used to dealing with the system, and effectively addressing both these financial, share price, stockholder issues, as well as more qualitative factors, supports the achievement of our desired customer and policy outcomes. So, as I've said, traditional cost of service rate making, which was created around a century ago, is often considered the baseline. But we've working on alternatives and additions to that traditional model for quite some time. A restructuring in wholesale markets are a utility business model reform, for example. New options have been continually explored around the United States and around the world. When you're thinking about state jurisdictional utility business model reform in a place like New Jersey, where we're talking about the electric distribution companies, you also need to understand that they are often part of broader conglomerates with different kinds of business interests. Now, what are the challenges with traditional cost of service rate making as we have known it? Cost control, capital bias, throughput incentive, and sometimes inattention to certain public policy goals are, this is the typical list of what everyone tends to wrestle with. Cost control and affordability, capital bias, as President Sadovy mentioned, utilities tend to make more money if they make capital investments versus operational expenses. Throughput incentives, more sales makes the utility profits go up, right? And then public policy goals, the utilities do pay attention to these, right? They care about them, but it's a question of relative priorities. Performance-based regulation. This is my opinion, is a set of tools to incentivize and improve utility performance. It's not a shortcut. It's not necessarily easy. It takes significant care and attention. And modern performance-based regulation, I think, should be considered a formalization of, an improvement on, historically less rigorous methods used to evaluate utilities. Utility commissioners forever have cared about utility performance. We care about doing better than the old ways. The utilities' choices are shaped by the full regulatory regime, not just individual pieces of it. And then outcome-based performance incentives, which we'll get to in more detail today, rewards or penalties, are a method for encouraging utility management to strive for the best possible results without micromanaging the means to get there. So PBR is often talked about as a bundle of reforms, and there is a typical list. The list that I'm going to talk through today is a little bit different than some of the lists other people use. Multi-year rate plans and performance incentive mechanisms are almost always on the list. We're going to talk about consideration of non-traditional solutions and modernizing utility planning processes. Those are not always on the list of PBR reforms. They're closely connected. I think there are things that are either directly in the executive order or otherwise on the table here in New Jersey. But we want to talk about how these things are all linked. That PBR, consideration of alternative solutions, and utility planning processes are all very closely related issues. You need to think about how one is connected to the other. All right, let's start with multi-year rate plans as we get a little bit more down into the details. Multi-year rate plans establish utility revenue trajectories over multiple years, right? That's right in the words of the what we're talking about. Often it's a cap and there's decoupling. It doesn't have to be. The multi-year rate plan can be defined in different ways over time, either using future test years or having some kind of revenue formula, often terms as I minus X, as I minus X plus Z, all sorts of other different variations on that. Not all multi-year rate plans are created equal. Like anything else in life, it can be done poorly, without careful thought about what you're trying to do. One key thing, there's lots of different details to consider under that heading, but in particular, it is important to consider how a multi-year rate plan is integrated with capital trackers and other revenue adjustment clauses. It's all part of the same picture. Now, why do a multi-year rate plan? What are the benefits? Lower administrative costs for the agency, for the utilities, for stakeholders that participate in these processes, for the general public that participate in these processes. If you're not working on a rate case, it frees up your time to work on something else. It's also a way to, smooth out trajectories over time, potentially leading to less frequent and smaller rate changes. Now, multi-year rate plan is formalized with a stay-out period, where the utility is not allowed to file another rate case unless meets one of various exceptions that are sometimes put into these things. You can build in a number of different subcomponents into a multi-year rate plan. Earning sharing mechanisms can limit a utility's earnings from cost reductions or other steps they take during the case, and has other sort of incentive effects as well on the utility. And then revenue adjustment clauses and other features of PBR can soften stay-out periods. So a stay-out period is not necessarily absolute. You can do an absolute stay-out period, but that's not what it tends to be. There tends to be various exceptions and ongoing trackers or adjustment clauses that are built into it, but that's one of the key levers that the BPU has. Now, the performance incentives is the second most frequently, or maybe even the most frequently cited element of PBR, right? How do you actually measure performance in performance-based regulation? That can come in a variety of different categories: data reporting, metrics, and then ultimately financial incentives. Tracking utility performance and customer outcomes is in fact vital to ensuring that you're doing a good job in your regulatory framework. You can track these things with various levels of complexity, public disclosure. That starts with informal regulatory monitoring. There's always lots of information in these dockets. The question is, how do you see that information? Who sees that information? With what frequency? You can take these reporting requirements, you can put them on a public website, right? So everyone, the governor can bring the website URL to every single event and hand out business cards, right? Like how many people, what is the desired public outreach plan to like get people to know about these outcomes, right? Is the major question on a lot of these things. Once you have reporting requirements and disclosure requirements, these can be benchmarked against historical performance for that same utility. It can be benchmarked against other jurisdictions or other targets. So there's a number of different ways to, what are you comparing the results to? And then building off these reporting requirements, what do you attach financial rewards and penalties to incentivize the utilities? Typically, there's a lot of practical considerations around this. You typically want to tie it to well understood and established metrics that are clear for people to understand. Now, this slide shows a few different things. The key thing is that you can implement PBR with either rewards or penalties, right? And you can think about rewards and penalties as very different things, but you actually want to think about the full utility revenue picture in that context. On the left is typically the traditional model of utility revenue. OpEx, and then you have the rate of return on top of it. In a PBR model with only rewards, you can actually get to a very similar place in terms of overall utility revenue. You do that by reducing the baseline revenue and adding the rewards on top of that. Alternatively, you can stay with the revenue levels on the left and implement a penalty system. The way the utility stays whole under a penalty system is to do a great job and not trigger any of the penalties, right? If they don't get any of the penalties in the right-hand part of this chart, they get the exact same revenue as they get under the traditional model. So you can get to similar places under different versions of a PBR incentive scheme. There can be differences in the timing of revenue collection, other subtleties, but whether you do it as a reward or as a penalty, it really matters how you're putting together the entire package. What the baseline revenue is, what the penalties are, what the rewards are, all together. So a few more detailed considerations here. Outcome-based performance incentives, not input-based. Encourage utility management to strive for the best possible results on those outcomes. You don't necessarily need to micromanage how they're getting there, right? You can ask more specific questions about how they're achieving these outcomes, but you don't necessarily have to. Constructing these packages of incentives, ideally, you want to find a triple win: a better deal for consumers, improved regulatory and public policy outcomes, and net financial benefits for well-run utilities. All of those words are important. If a utility is doing poorly, you don't necessarily want them to have net financial benefits from this system, right? So, historically, the way that performance incentives have been implemented have usually been small, reward-only add-ons to existing rate-making practices. We're stuck in this debate between consumer advocates who don't want extra rewards for the utilities and the utilities themselves who are afraid of penalties. So we've been in many of these debates in most states stuck in a very small range of what we're talking about in terms of money on the table and how big the incentive is for the utility to really get better results. All right, now we're getting a little further afield from what is typically considered PBR into closely connected issues. How do we get the utilities to consider non-traditional, often non-utility alternative solutions to major capital investments? Alternatives, some of these can be utility owned. Some of them are in fact utility capital investments still, but they're different kinds of capital investments with that they may not be as used to as an operational matter or any number of other reasons, new technology that they're not sure about. Grid enhancing technologies, better wires, right? We're literally at a point in time in technology that there are better wires than the old wires. It's kind of a funny thing. Customer energy efficiency, distributed generation. Storage can be owned by distribution companies, can be owned by customers, and can be owned by third parties. And there can be different roles for those three different types of storage. Now, how do you get the utilities to consider non-traditional alternatives? You can let them be rate-based. You can have a shared savings model. You can procedurally require cost-benefit analysis. You can build it into prudence review for the utilities when they're making their choices. You can require competitive solicitations. There's all sorts of substantive, process, and incentives-based ways to encourage or require utilities to consider different types of solutions. Now, the next circle out. Again, not always included in our list of PBR considerations, but utility planning. How do we modernize utility planning requirements? We want to ensure that they incorporate best practices, incorporate public policy goals and programs, and provide transparency to complement PBR. This all needs to work together. There's a wide range of best practices. advanced forecasting and system modeling, disclosure of system needs and value of alternatives, improved solution acquisition practices, support for innovation, meaningful and equitable stakeholder participation. This list, we adapted this list from GridLab. Thank you, GridLab. But thinking about how we move into the future on all of these things is a broader conversation that is very connected to PBR. So I'm actually going to hand it back to Josh to get even more granular.
Great, thanks, Mark. And actually, I think maybe we want to pause here because there's lots of great content in what Mark was just walking through. And before and open it up for questions from the audience, either here or online. But before I do that too, I just want to go back to Mark's kind of level setting comments and just make sure it's really clear to everyone that when we talk about PBR, we're really talking about a series of specific regulatory mechanisms, and there's not one specific way to put those pieces together. We've seen lots of different ways to put that together. But they're all kind of tried and true mechanisms that have been adopted in other places. So just as you're starting this reform study, looking at, hey, it can really seem daunting, right? To really change the utility business model here in New Jersey. But really it's when we talk about that reform, it's made up of all these little pieces that have actually been tried and tested in other states. So it's really maybe not as much to bite off as it seems at first. So I just want to make sure that's really clear to everyone. So with that though, are there any questions for Mark on what he just proposed or walked through? And if you could just go to the mic so that folks online can hear you. And before you, can you just, yeah, can you see if it's turn it on? And again, it's for the folks that are online.
Thanks.
Thank
I'll
you.
repeat that. Andrew Hendry with Atlantic City Electric. Generally speaking, we're supportive of the concept of performance-based rate making and being, held accountable for, measurable, objective criteria. And when I heard the overview of what some of the other states are doing, I mean, one of the things that something that we think is essential in structuring performance-based rate making is that it be symmetrical. And you talked about states that have sort of an upside only. And it's our understanding from some of the data that we've looked at from like the Rocky Mountain Institute that is the case, that's the vast majority of them. There's very, very few, a couple of percent, as I understand it, that have a downside only system for performance-based rate making. But what about a symmetrical system where there's potential upside and there's potential downside? And don't you see that as potentially the fairest way to do things?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can actually take it first and let Mark chime in. I will say, I think it depends on the specific PIM or performance incentive mechanism that you're talking about. Some you'll see are, particularly if you're talking about reliability, there's other jurisdictions where they'll have a downside only PIM, but then they might have other PIMs that are upside only and some that are symmetrical. So it's really about, and Mark got at this, thinking about things holistically as a package and how they complement each other. But when we're talking about upside or downside, it really matters what the specific mechanism is and what we're measuring against. But I'll let Mark elaborate on that.
Is this one on? Yeah. All right. So Illinois has symmetric PIMs. I think in the Illinois context, they didn't change anything else about the revenue model, and they built symmetric PIMs around the way they've always been doing it. And we know Illinois commissioners and people in Illinois who can speak to exactly why that was. That was mandated in the legislation that it had to be symmetric. Look, as I said, I had the slide that showed the three different revenue models, three different ways to do it. It really depends on the package, right? And the other thing, I'm not sure I mentioned that I have a law degree. So like the funny thing about it is like the utilities have Fifth and 14th Amendment protections that like if you're cutting revenue in a bunch of other ways and then you implement a bunch of penalties on top of that, eventually you'll start to like hit on the actual fundamental legal protections. So like how you put it all together matters. And it's, in my opinion, at least, it's really about the package that and the way you're constructing all these different things together.
Yeah, and just to validate your underlying point, though, fairness obviously has to be a consideration in whatever PIM is designed and how it's designed. So great question. Any other questions here in person? And again, if you have a question, if you could just go to the mic, name and affiliation first, and then go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, good morning. Anthony Crowdell at Mizuho, investment firm in Manhattan. Just two quick questions. You gave a nice, I think the deadline sometime in July. Just thoughts on post-July, the timing of maybe implementation. Is that something that occurs in, 2026 or 2027? And then the second, just follow up, you gave a very detailed of the customer bill and all the different categories. I'm just curious because it occurred in New York. You left out taxes. I'm just curious your thought on why you left it out, and thank you so much.
Thank you for that.
I think you have to turn it on. Yeah.
Okay. I did mention taxes. I didn't try and show it on that slide because it's embedded in a bunch of the different parts of it, but taxes are absolutely one of the considerations that we know we have to take a look at. With regard to the post-July timing, we're looking at the initial output from the consultant to hit that July 19th deadline. We expect there to be a detailed implementation that comes after that for the different things that come out of that initial report. So I can't prejudge what that workflow will look like. There may be some things that we can launch in the second half of 2026, and we're going to be looking to do that. Other things are long-term structural, and we're gonna take the time to be thoughtful on those. I can't prejudge it at this point, but we're not looking to put that report in a drawer. It's gonna be an action document when we get it.
Thank you.
And you asked about a specific date too, July 19th. It's on one of Bob's slides.
Thanks.
Great. Any other questions in the room? Oh, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really great material, so really appreciate it. Mark, I feel like you mentioned in one of your later slides that the PBRs you've seen have been a lot of like smaller add-ons, and so maybe they haven't had like the intended effect maybe that we're looking for. I'm curious, are there like any solid markets that we can look to as like good examples for implementing these PBRs in New Jersey?
Look, I think Hawaii, New York, Illinois, like the UK, like there's people playing with these different variables already. The question is, what's the next iteration? Like, how can we, build on those examples and keep doing better?
Yeah, I would say Hawaii is probably the one that's done the most comprehensive reforms. It's Alberta as well in Canada. Rio is also usually a model that we look to. It's done a lot as well on this front. It's yeah, like Mark said, I think no matter who's done it most comprehensively, Colorado, Minnesota have also done a lot of legwork on laying out goals and outcomes that they'd want for a PBR framework, regardless of what a certain jurisdiction did. How you put those pieces together, it matters to your specific jurisdiction. So I think I think there are definitely, and we'll talk about this with the panel, lessons to be learned about how Hawaii and other jurisdictions have done that comprehensively. But I actually think it's equally as valuable to just look at the specific mechanisms that were put in place in certain jurisdictions and then just package all of those things together. Any other questions in person? Darren, do we have any questions online? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the slides I was supposed to cover. Well, great. So Mark touched on the importance of data reporting and metrics to be able to evaluate utility performance and customer outcomes to make sure that your regulatory framework, whether or not it's performance-based regulation or not, is having the intended effect. I just want to get a little bit more into the weeds on that specific topic. would say a best practice that we've seen in states, and actually building off of the last question, in states that have gone about trying to implement or at least design comprehensive performance-based regulation frameworks, is to lay out at the outset what are the regulatory goals that you have in your jurisdiction. One of the reasons that that's really important to do at this moment is we all know kind of the traditional regulatory goals of safe and reliable service and affordable service. And then we know over the last 20 or so years we've added clean to that, and we're asking more and more, and we have more and more goals that we're expecting of and trying to reaching for. And so we want to make sure and reset kind of expectations and make sure everyone's on the same page about what are ultimately the goals of utility regulation here in New Jersey. In order to be able to then track to see if you're being effective with those goals, it's really important to then tie those to specific priority customer and utility outcomes that would indicate whether or not you're successful in achieving those goals. And we'll have, and actually folks should have some examples from other jurisdictions. Just want to be really, really clear. Those examples are illustrative just for you to have in front of you so you know what we're talking about here. So for example, in I believe it was Hawaii, I don't have it in front of me, but they had utility performance was one of their regulatory goals. One of the outcomes that could be associated with utility performance is improved or high utilization rates, right, of existing assets to build on Bob's point earlier. So you want to tie specific goals to then outcomes that you're looking for that would again indicate success as part of those goals. And then you of course need to then tie that to specific things that are measurable to be able to indicate whether or not you've achieved those outcomes. Utilization rate's a convenient one because there are many different ways to measure utilization. You could do it system-wide, you could do it at the feeder level, but that's the type of thing where you could actually have tangible metrics to be able to start to address whether or not you're achieving that outcome. So just want to lay out that framework is really helpful, and we've seen it as a best practice in Hawaii and Connecticut and a bunch of other jurisdictions where they started with this framework to make sure that as they go through the study process and look at different specific mechanisms that they might implement or reforms that might be made, that they're guided by these regulatory goals and priority customer outcomes. And it helps you when you're having these debates about, oh, should this PIM have this type of incentive, should it be upside, downside, or symmetrical? It gives you a North Star or a set of principles that you're actually designing around. Wrong way. Great. And then, so after the break, so we're going to take a quick break. We're a little bit early, but we can come back around 10:40. And after the break, we're going to come back and talk with our former utility commissioners to talk about the regulatory reforms that they spearheaded and have experience with in other jurisdictions. And then after that, we're going to have a facilitated discussion around these three key questions. What are the regulatory goals that should drive the Executive Order 1 study on utility business model reforms and any subsequent investigations? What are the customer outcomes that should be prioritized in any business model reforms? And then what specific mechanisms do you think would help achieve those two things and you would recommend to BPU to actually move that forward? So we want everyone to think about those three questions over the break so you can come prepared after the commissioner roundtable to provide us your feedback. With that, we'll see everyone. Oh, go ahead, Bob.
Thanks, Josh. Just before you go, I just want to clarify that 180 days from the issuance of the executive order is July 19th, but that's a Sunday. So, Monday the 20th will be the release date.
Gotcha. Helpful clarification. Thanks, Bob. All right, great. We'll see everyone at 10:40.
No.
Yeah.
This is the good part.
Yeah, no, I had to go back.
Creating my full life, right? I would never know, sir.
It's about encouraging innovation, critical thinking.
About that.
I do.
Did you like that?
I didn't think Mark's slide captured the way I see Annalisa. And what's working.
Yeah. Like, innovation.
Yeah, it's symmetrical. Doesn't matter.
Maybe the.
What time is it for Jay? Like 1:30 in the morning?
Better, well, like when it's done, like it's 6 hours.
6 hours.
All right, folks, we're gonna start here shortly, so if everyone can take their seats.
My name right on, it's pretty cool. Put my name right on that.
Calm down, Janice.
Do you mean?
All right, well, welcome back, everyone from the break. Hopefully everyone was able to recaffeinate and connect with colleagues. I'm really excited about this next portion of the program, as it's not often that you have this collection of such esteemed and well-regarded regulatory practitioners in one place. Really excited to be joined by 4 former commissioners this morning. First off, we have Jay Griffin, who is the U.S. Program Executive Chair for RAP. He's actually been on the whole time. I think it's 5 a.m. in Hawaii right now, so thank you, Jay, for being here. Jay is the former PUC Commissioner of the Hawaii PUC. We're also joined by Sarah Freeman, who's a principal at RAP, and also a former commissioner at the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. We also have Carrie Zielinski, who's currently a senior vice president at Constellation and a former chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission. And of course, in person, we introduced him earlier. We have Jamie Van Nostrand, who's currently the policy director at the Future of Heat Initiative and the former Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities chair. So as we touched on earlier, performance-based regulation is made up of a suite of regulatory mechanisms that are intended to better align utility spending and financial incentives with public policy objectives and customer outcomes. These mechanisms in and of themselves are not novel. Many of them, like multi-year rate plans, have been around for decades. This panel will explore the experience of these former regulators with performance-based regulation mechanisms, how they tackled designing and implementing them, how they balanced integrating them with existing regulatory mechanisms, and any lessons learned they'd like to share with New Jersey. And would someone mind shutting the door? That'd be great. Thank you. All right. So I want to kick off our discussion with a quick round robin with each former commissioner on their experience and familiarity with PBR and PBR mechanisms, both during their time at the commission and before and after. So let's start here in person with former Chair Van Nostrand.
Thanks, Josh. And thanks for the opportunity. Thanks to my friends from RAP for allowing me to be here. And President Sadovy, it's really great talking to you this morning. Thanks for the opportunity to join this group. So I was a practicing attorney for many years in the Northwest, and then I became a law professor. And I got to say, before I got to Massachusetts, my experience with PBRs was strictly as an academic regulatory theory, regulatory wonk, and sort of all the things that Mark LaBelle mentioned in terms of avoiding frequent rate cases, providing a stronger incentive for utilities to control costs, multi-year rate plans. I think generally, I guess in all the states I worked in were vertically integrated, so there wasn't much of an opening for PBR. But for those states where you're just looking at regular, just routine operating and maintenance expenses, I think the PBR, the multi-year rate plan, works really well by providing that incentive, keeps the utility out of rate cases, gives them, a chance to keep some of the savings if they actually achieve some cost reductions. It gets more complicated if you have a growing rate base, which is what we have now with the need for the clean energy build outs. You have to have some separate mechanism. Of course, you got all kinds of trackers which play in there, which tend to dampen some of the incentives that the PBR mechanism itself provides. So when I got to Massachusetts, I was fortunate enough that had been in place in Massachusetts for several years before I got there. And so I'll be talking a little bit later. I'll save that till later, but in terms of what I was able to do in Massachusetts, but basically before I got to Massachusetts, it was really just that, and the very model that I think that was what I basically taught in all my regulatory classes. This is the very thing that Mark talked about that was put in place in Hawaii and a number of other states with the inflation adjustment, with the productivity offset and exogenous factor, all those sorts of things with multi-year rate plans and decoupling. So with that, I'm happy to talk later about what we did in Massachusetts in terms of modifications to PBR while I was chair.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jamie. And just to reiterate a point that Mark made earlier too, the devil is in the details in all of these things. And just pointing to Massachusetts, the chair will talk later about some great things that he was able to accomplish while there. I had the pleasure of working with him in Massachusetts recently as Assistant Secretary of Energy. And I'll just highlight, if you do look at the multi-year rate plans that were in Massachusetts, like I said, details matter. So not all the elements there are maybe necessarily best practices, but again, it is one example for you to look at. And there are things that could be tweaked to better align that mechanism with the outcomes that you're looking for here in New Jersey. So with that, let's go to Sarah next.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everybody. I'm so jealous of Josh and Jamie and Mark that they get to be there in person with you, although I was lucky enough to spend the last couple of days with Commissioner Christodoulou. So that did make up for being virtual a little bit. So my experience with PBR is actually really recent because Indiana just enacted PBR legislation this year, and the IURC is now in the process of implementing it. But before that, for me, like PBR was always this thing that the cool commissions like Hawaii were doing. And so I was really excited when the General Assembly finally, directed us to study it a few years ago. Before I joined the commission in 2016, the commission had already been tracking a lot of performance metrics, mostly reliability based, but a lot of them for years across various utility collaboratives. And the commission had always really been eager to play with that data, but was waiting for a policy go ahead from the legislature because that's the relationship that exists in Indiana. And for myself, I really wanted to find ways to, improve performance and nudge utility behaviors for customer benefit, and specifically with affordability in mind. So hopefully later I'll get to talk more about the legislative process that led to the adoption and now implementation of PBR in Indiana. But I'll just say that over time, my perception of PBR has matured from just something cool to something that can be truly meaningful and useful. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sarah. Let's go to Carrie next.
Morning. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
We can, yeah.
Great. Good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today. Thank you, President Sedova and the Honorable Commissioners. Again, I'm sorry too that I can't be there in person. May is crazy, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to speak to you all. So thank you for this opportunity. I'll speak briefly about how Illinois was thinking about PBR first, but I'd like to start off with 5 truths as I see them in the current state that we are in right now, particularly in New Jersey. May be stated most simply and most obviously, but I think is important. New Jersey customers are frustrated. Politicians are hyper-focused on affordability, as they absolutely should be. We see bills rising for a variety of reasons. Distribution and transmission costs are becoming a bigger percentage of the bill. Again, with good reason, the grid is outdated. Truth two, though, the commissioner job is harder than it's ever been. Harder certainly when I was a commissioner. Every decision now has consequences. If you delay investment, reliability risks grow. If you move too aggressively, you worry about affordability. And if you get planning wrong, a customer can play twice. Truth three, and this will kind of frame some of the conversation that I'll be talking about PBR. PBR frameworks that I'm discussing, and I think a lot of my other panelists, were designed during a decade of flat load growth. So that is very different than I think the challenge before you. That world obviously is gone, which gets to my second truth of why a commissioner's job is truly harder than it's ever been. But I'm going to end with 2, I think, pieces of good news. Fourth truth is that industry has more tools than ever. Since leaving the commission, I've had the chance to learn a lot about innovative technologies, hardware and software, advances in things like storage and analytics, and demand flexibility, and new business models. So I think it's an exciting time to be looking at this, especially knowing that all these new tools are out there and they've even started to be tested on the grid. And then I think the fifth truth, which is important, is that New Jersey is not doing this alone. RAP is an incredibly valuable resource. When I was a commissioner, I valued their input and help so much. I know that commissions are stressed, they are under-resourced, and they were very helpful that when I was a commissioner, and so I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to give back and volunteer on the council that was started under the leadership of Jay Griffin. So, I will get off my soapbox, but please know that RAP is here to help. You can see how wonderful they are. So please continue to reach out with questions. Very quickly in 60 seconds. So in Illinois, I think, like Sarah was saying, we were thrust into the PBR world under legislation. The Climate and Equitable Jobs Act was the legislation that was passed while I was at the commission. I should mention, I was at the commission from 2019 to 2023. So we passed CEJA. It did a lot of things, but it pushed out a requirement to put out performance-based metrics. And in the legislation, there were a variety of categories that we had to discuss with regard to affordability, reliability, interconnection, performance, equity outcomes, peak demand reduction. And I'm happy to go through kind of what we did in the first round of these different metrics. So, better for worse, we were required to do it under legislation, but it also means that we were limited by what the legislation said and under their very strict timeline. So again, that can be good and bad. And there was a round 2 since I've left, and these dockets are in the able hands of Chair Scott and the commission, and they're doing a great job. But I did notice that there were changes made in the second round, and I think a lot of it is from lessons learned and reflecting upon what we could have done different in the first round. I'll pause there. I know there'll be more discussion on this in the conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Carrie. Really looking forward to getting into the details on some of these mechanisms with all of you. I think it's a really great point about legislation can be helpful in kind of pushing the envelope and also having kind of aggressive timelines, but also can be a limiting factor. So that's a really helpful flag. And I will say, just for the record, we did not pay Carrie to say those nice things. Carrie is one of, I believe it's 9 former commissioners that are on a council of commissioners that advise RAP and also provide input to other commissions as well. So really lucky to have all the folks on this panel on that commission. Well, I want to end with you, Jay. Can you just give us a quick overview of your experience with PBR and the process in Hawaii?
Hi there, everyone. Can you hear okay?
We can, yeah.
Greetings, good morning. I want to quickly thank President Gulskadovy the New Jersey commissioners, everyone from the BPU have been incredibly supportive so far. My colleagues that have spoken so far. So my lightning round opening, a lot of things have been said about Hawaii, but what I want to share, especially up front, is that the drivers that led Hawaii to do this earlier are what I see exactly going on in New Jersey today. And so for us and for myself at the commission, high rates. I mean, Hawaii had, and unfortunately continues to have, we can get into that too, highest retail rates in the United States, largely driven by our imported oil here. And so our whole state's clean energy transition is about driving out the oil in the system that we use and replacing with clean energy. And what had happened over the decade of the early part of that transition, a lot of that key enabling legislation passed in the late 2000s, early around 2009, 2010. By the mid 2010s, clean, at least in Hawaii, solar plus storage, even rooftop solar paired with batteries, was beating the price of oil. And by the time I became chair and the time we led our major initiative, the solar plus storage projects were about a third to a half of the cost of oil-fired generation in the state. So we had huge potential for lowering costs with clean energy, and essentially, a business model that didn't support that very well. And so like our urgency to this is with the urgency that you feel in New Jersey today. It just happened earlier in our state. And so a lot of the pressures and the drivers for reform are the same. And that led us to go on that journey earlier. I'll talk more about a lot of the things that we did, but it really did culminate in about a decade of different reform efforts. We started with a decoupling mechanism. We looked at other initial PIMs, and by the time, as I alluded to in 2018, we'd had a 2.5-year comprehensive docket. My own personal history, I was on staff at the time we started a lot of this. So my experience was with some of the early investigations into PBR for myself and a lot of our staff. So we built our own internal capacity understanding of a lot of these details by the time we took on more comprehensive reform. The good news for New Jersey, as you can see here, there's a lot more experience throughout the states, things that you can build on. And last things I want to finish with the opening. Mark talked about in his presentation opportunities here for triple wins. We put that at the center of the framework when we started in Hawaii. What we were looking at were opportunities to lower bills, stabilize bills, establish a fair regulatory framework. In our context, we'd had, I think, one relatively low credit rating and actually a recent credit rating downgrade by the time we started our PBR reforms. And again, meeting our public policy goals, but those were all tied together. We needed a strong utility to help enact a lot of these reforms, but it was largely driven by lowering our costs, lowering our cost of living in the state. And we saw the reforms that we put in place is central to that. And Josh, I'll turn it back over to you. I can talk, we'll talk more about some of the specifics and look forward to our discussion among my colleagues here.
Yeah, no, Jay, I actually wanted to pull on that last thread a little bit more. We touched on earlier that Hawaii is regarded probably as the jurisdiction that has done the most comprehensive performance-based regulatory reforms, at least in the US. Jay, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you and your team structured the investigation to be so effective, and what were the most important factors that guided your investigation and the reforms that you ultimately implemented?
Great, thanks, Shot. Yeah, just for the everyone's reference here, what I'm going to be talking about here is the comprehensive PBR reforms that we initiated in 2018. If you want to go and look further in the details, which I know probably many in the audience will or have already, it's a docket 2018-0088. Some pretty good overview materials on the Hawaii Commission website. We started this, there was some enabling legislation that passed right earlier in 2018. It was termed the Ratepayer Protection Act. But the Commission had long anticipated launching a comprehensive reform, which we did in April 2018. We established that from the outset of intending to do 2 phases. One, the initial phase to look basically a lot of what we've talked about here going into the discussion already. One, our first workshop in that initial phase was to a more basic level view. What are the goals and outcomes that stakeholders throughout Hawaii wanted to see from a reform regulatory? Basically, what do we want from our electric utility of the future or going into the future? So we had a broad discussion on the goals and outcome framework, and really that was to set some foundational information for everyone and just hear from everyone what their desires were. The commission was very much in a stakeholder-driven listening phase. We retained the significant groups of consultants to help us facilitate that discussion, including Rapid come in. The Rocky Mountain Institute was a strong partner with the commission to help run that initial phase of the proceedings and do the facilitation. We're very grateful for all of that help. And that initial foundation kind of listening sessions built into a review of the current framework and recommendations to the commission by the end of phase one. So that was about a 1-year process. So in May of 2019, we issued our final order on phase one, and that the commission agreed to, or the commission adopted, our broad framework for regulatory reforms. So what did that include? A directive to move towards a 5-year multi-year rate plan, adopt a comprehensive and ideally symmetric set of performance incentive mechanisms, and a number of other structural changes to some of our risk and recovery frameworks and earnings sharing mechanism, some changes to our reconciliation mechanisms, and the changes to our pilot process. So that phase one decision gave an overview. This is where we want to go. Phase two really was all of the devil, all of the details that we tried to take on in 18 months. And in the middle of that, if you look at the timeline here, that was 2019 to the end of 2020. We had a once in a century pandemic intercede in the middle of our phase two. So in a very intense period for our commission to take on all that reform, all of those various different pieces, but we knew it was important to setting that direction and guidance for the future. So we did finalize the framework by the end of 2020. And foundational to that was all of the important stakeholder work that we did in the beginning in phase one. And so I'll turn it back to Josh and my other esteemed colleagues here.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jay. It sounds like kind of setting those goals and kind of priority outcomes early in the process was key to ensuring public understanding and buy-in, and something that was helpful to build off of in your phase two of the proceeding. And I know other states have taken similar approaches there. I want to turn it to Carrie now too. Just to, I think we heard in all the commissioners' initial responses, touching on, but maybe not diving too much into the context in which some of these regulatory reforms were explored. So I want to hear more, Carrie, from you, Sarah, and Jamie about that context and what maybe regulatory goals and priority outcomes were you really laser focused on trying to actually promote and move forward in your jurisdiction?
Yeah, I can start off. Great question. And I mentioned that there were categories set out by legislation, and I'll touch on kind of all of them very quickly, and then I'll spend a little bit more time on peak load reduction and the affordability metric, because it sounds like New Jersey is hyper-focused on that as well. So one of the categories was reliability, resiliency, and it was a metric to measure outage duration and reliability performance, looking at things like improved SAIDI and SAIFI performance. Another category was equity reliability. We focused on environmental justice communities and measured repeat outages and long duration outages, in particular zip codes. Another one was interconnection timeliness, and I think this is something New Jersey is looking at as well. That's looking at things like DER processing speed and backlog reduction, study timing, and permission to operate timelines. Another one was customer service, was measuring the time that the EDC was responsive and first contact resolution. but I'll go a little bit slower talking about peak load reduction and affordability. So on peak load reduction, the metric that we pushed out was we used baselines from 2023, looking at 3 particular programs, and I'll use the ComEd region. One was the Central AC Cycling Direct Load Control. This is a DR program that ComEd has. Peak time savings and hourly pricing. So we used the baseline from 2023, and then we measured at the end of a metric how ComEd performed. On this particular metric, I know there was a conversation about, whether the metric, if you can both gain and lose on the outcome. And on this one, ComEd actually underperformed and received a penalty. And I think there's a lesson to be learned here on how the metric was written. So when writing a metric, you have to make sure that you set the utility up for success, or at least the opportunity for success, making sure that the thing you're trying to achieve is truly and fully within the control of the utility. And there was, I think, in reflection upon the second round, looking where it was harder for the utility to have control over some of the way the customer reacted to some of these programs. So this was a metric that probably could have been refined and more directly aligned with what the utility could actually do, which was within their control to the outcome that you're trying to receive. So I think there is a lesson to be learned here. On the affordability, this was a measured reduction in residential disconnections for zip codes, looking at some of the highest historical disconnection rates, and the utility would earn incentives if disconnection declined below average targets. And this was a place where ComEd overperformed. So they saw a reduction in disconnections. One thing, though, upon reflection and maybe a takeaway, is that like any good study that you do, the controls are sometimes the hardest things, right? To figure out if it was actually the behavior of the utility, if there were other things going on. And so it was noted when we're looking at round 1 outcomes that ComEd transitioned to a new customer information system. So there was question about did that have anything to do with achieving this metric? So making sure that controls are accounted for and aligned to the outcome. And I'll just note that we're going to talk about what we did and what we learned, but it's really hard to get these things perfect, and I like to think of it more as an iterative process. I doubt it's hard for anybody to get it right the first time. Illinois didn't. So I'll just note that I'm not suggesting we have the answers, just reflection upon the first time. It might not be perfect, but it can be used as a process to get better in the second round.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Carrie. And I think the states, at least from my perspective, that have been most successful, acknowledge that at the outset and actually have systems in place to iterate over time and make fine tuning and adjustments to reflect the realities that they see after they've made reforms. Let's turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. I'm glad you mentioned iteration, Carrie, because the process so far in Indiana has definitely been iterative, and I expect it to continue to be so. So, as I indicated in my opening comments, PBR is very new in Indiana, with the legislation just being passed earlier this year. And the development of the eventual PBR legislation in House Enrolled Act 1002 actually required 2 passes through the legislative process. First, to enact legislation directing the Indiana Commission to conduct a PBR study and then report its findings back to the General Assembly. And then a second time for the most recent session for drafting and passage of the actual legislation itself, which not only enabled PBR implementation, but it included some additional affordability provisions that I want to take time to mention, because the bill was highly publicized, especially by the Indiana governor, as an affordability bill. And these are some of the specific affordability provisions in it. It requires mandatory levelized what we used to call budget billing, that's now being called levelized billing across utilities, quarterly reporting by utilities to the consumer advocate on payment plans, disconnections, and uncollectibles. It imposes limitations on summer disconnections in addition to the usual winter moratorium. And it also mandates low-income customer assistance programs for all of the investor-owned utilities in Indiana, of which there are 5. So for both iterations of this legislation that eventually became PBR, the House and Senate Utilities Chairman convened a working group during the interims between sessions to inform their thinking. And I mean, obviously, there was a lot of behind closed door stuff that I was never privy to, but I really appreciated, and I want to emphasize the importance of this collaborative process that was used in Indiana, because the bill authors took the time to gather together a broad group and the right group of stakeholders, I felt, to develop an initial bill draft. This group was very clearly in a consultative role, and I know that because the bill authors at every meeting would tell us, you are in a consultative role. But these leaders are also very skilled at listening, even when they chose a path different from maybe what you were suggesting to them. So you felt heard, and you knew that they were making informed decisions, even if they were political. And there was also, of course, the robust public legislative process with lots of public hearings, opportunities for floor amendments, and then again at the end of the session, public conference committee meetings where people could share their thoughts directly with their legislators. So in full disclosure, I staffed both of the chairmen for 10 years when I was a legislative staffer, a nonpartisan legislative staffer. And I really felt very comfortable with the process they were using. It was more than adequately robust, is how I would describe it. Now, the study itself that was required of the IURC, they engaged with a consultant for that. And that process included 2 stakeholder surveys and a hybrid stakeholder workshop to inform the study. And then 1 round of public comment on the study itself that then informed the commission's eventual report to the General Assembly. And the participants in the surveys, the stakeholder workshop, and then the public comment included all of Indiana's investor-owned utilities, both individually and as represented by their trade association, the state consumer advocate, other residential and industrial consumer advocacy groups at both the local and national levels, and Indiana's coal lobby, because that's how Indiana rolls. But I just really wanted to take time to lay out that process. It was about as good as I feel processes like this can get. And I encourage that type of collaboration and iteration whenever possible. And then I'll get into the specifics a little bit later about what came out of that. Thanks,
Perfect.
Josh.
No, thank you, Sarah. All right. Well, Jamie, anything more about the kind of context for PPR in Massachusetts and any goals or specific outcomes you were hoping to move forward?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. As I mentioned, when I became chair of the Massachusetts Commission in May of 2023, PBR had been in place in Massachusetts for about 6 years, since 2017, 2018, 5-year rate plans. So I didn't have the benefit of having what I think is a great opportunity here in New Jersey, and you're going to get the benefit of what Indiana and Hawaii and Illinois did in terms of having a blank slate. So I mean, I'll talk about it later, but in terms of things that we did to modify what was currently in place in order to achieve some policy objectives. But I think it's great to have that blank slate, and I would say an opportunity and a need to move nimbly. I think gather input. I think one of the things we accomplished in Massachusetts when I was there was more public participation. We appointed a director of environmental justice and public participation, communications director, much better outreach, much better engagement with the public. But I think having the opportunity to really get broad participation in this process is really essential. And I think the policy objectives is really just trying to align sort of big picture. What are we trying to do? We're trying to depart from traditional rate making and try to encourage utilities to pursue certain objectives, then how do you design a mechanism that's going to reward the utility for pursuing those objectives? So that's what we had in mind in terms of what we were trying to accomplish in Massachusetts. And I really like the format of just informal workshops, technical sessions. I think once you get into this process where you have formal evidentiary hearings, my lawyer cross-examines your expert, your lawyer cross-examines my expert, that's not a great way to achieve the truth, I think. And for the most part, these are policy decisions. I don't know that you need to have a whole lot of evidentiary record taken on issues that are really policy and decisions. And so I think, allowing the commission to hear the input from the public, but then providing some broad findings in terms of this is the direction we'd like to go based on what we heard, and then let the parties move forward and refine things further. But I think trying to have a informal, broad participation, and identify those policy objectives, and then refine it as you go forward.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's some of these things are really weedy and hard to get into in a formal setting. And I think Massachusetts DPU did a really good job of often actually having informal kind of proceedings ahead of a formal adjudication that really helps get out some of those weedy issues and work through them, and then have the adjudication when needed. Well, we've danced around and teased all these specific mechanisms that all these former regulators have been a part of moving forward. Let's just dive head first into that. So I want to start with Sarah first. Can you just talk to us about the specific PBR mechanisms that are being explored in Indiana?
Sure can, yeah. And I expect a lot of what Jamie was just describing will take place over the next few years in Indiana as we see how these play out. So the recommendations of the PBR study were twofold and pretty straightforward. So, the consultant looked at Indiana's regulatory landscape, and they recommended the implementation of forecasted multi-year rate plans, as well as performance incentive mechanisms. They selected the forecasted MYRPs because they're incremental and wouldn't be overly disruptive to Indiana's existing regulatory framework, which already included phased-in rates in some areas, as well as forward test years. And then they selected PIMS because on several occasions, the IURC had previously made ad hoc downward ROE adjustments for poor performance or management. And there are also statutory financial incentives for demand side management and energy efficiency initiatives, as well as RTO participation. So those PIMs included concepts that were already familiar to Indiana's utilities and regulators. Now, digging into the MYRP a little bit more, the consultant specifically recommended the introduction of voluntary 3 or 4 year forecasted MYRPs that would include cost efficiency incentives to address affordability as well as cost control. They were less sanguine about pure price caps or revenue caps because Indiana is a vertically regulated state and operate in a couple of RTOs, and they thought that would be a little bit of shock to the system. For the PIMs, the IURC was recommended to first develop a set of specific policy goals for the PIMs to address, and then to implement them on a case-by-case basis. And ideally, setting those goals would include stakeholder engagement and additional studies by the IURC. So when the IURC reported all of this to the General Assembly, they asked to first be authorized to implement the PIMs because of the amount of performance data that they already had on hand, and to wait on the MYRP implementation until all of the utilities had filed rate cases using forward test years and they could determine how well that was working out, the accuracy of it, right? As an aside, the utilities wanted mandatory MYRPs and no PIMs. So when the law was finally passed this year, what it ended up doing was requiring the IURC to move immediately on both MYRPs on a 3-year staggered cycle for all 5 investor-owned utilities, and implement both reliability and affordability PIMs. So I guess it's good that this is neither what the IURC wanted nor what the utilities asked for. So I'm not a big fan of when we say, compromises, everybody, both sides are unhappy. I would like for both sides to be happy, but it was equitable. So the first this is going to take a little bit. There's a lot in here. The first MYRP will be filed this fall between November and December. And then the other 4 are going to be filed about every 6 months through 2029. Case in chief requirements are basically the same as for our standard rate cases. But again, forward test year is required, and that has to end concurrently with the second and third rate years in the MYRP. The utility can use any alternative regulatory practices or accounting treatments that are already available to them. And here's my sticking point with the legislation as drafted. Trackers don't have to be included in the MYRP. We say trackers in Indiana, rate adjustment mechanism, rider, whatever you might call it. They don't have to be included, although the utility could voluntarily include them. Now, in this first iteration of plans, the utilities do have to include a plan showing how trackers would be included in a future MYRP cycle if they were required to do so. So this could eventually favor customers if these were included in the revenue mechanism, but we'll see how that plays out and what these plans look like. For the PIMs, for affordability, the commission determines the metric and the incentive, but they're based on a utility-generated report, which will compare their average annual percentage change in residential bills to the CPI for the same period. The reliability PIM looks at service interruption and restoration using SAIDI, SAIFI, and CAIDI. Importantly here, they allow for rewards and penalties depending on the utility's performance. And that was very important to the legislation's authors. And with the commission right now being under such great scrutiny with respect to affordability, I'm optimistic that they're going to be able to use these to meaningful effect in Indiana.
Perfect. Thanks so much,
Mhm.
Sarah. And I think some of those details are really important. And I think, I forget if it's you or someone else earlier, and certainly Mark spoke to this, making sure we have clear data collection ahead of actually establishing a PIM is so important to making sure you can be effective with that mechanism long term. Let's go next to Jay.
Great, thanks, Josh. I want to touch on, I think one of the core elements that we found to achieve our goals was to institute the multi-year rate plan. In our case, we had 3 operating companies that were within our investor-owned utilities. They were each on different rate case cycles. They were already on a 3-year cycle, but staggered each year. So I think going back to some of the early comments that I heard, for those involved, that just meant rate cases every year, and that was exhausting for everyone. So there was broad agreement on moving to a longer 5-year period and consolidating the companies together. So I think broadly, there was support for this concept in the phase 1, and then we got to phase 2, and this is where there's really 2 broad strokes of what's necessary. It's like, how do you set what you call the inception rates? What's the starting point for the multi-year rate plan, the revenue cap? What's included? What's the level? And then what are the parameters of the formula that you use? So you can imagine very significant differences between the utilities' positions on those different stakeholders, our consumer advocate, and the commission. We used what I would say a fairly hybrid. In phase 2, we used a collaborative but hybrid formal process. What I mean by that is we asked the groups to work. We formed stakeholder groups led by our facilitators to develop recommendations to the commission. We held a panel hearing, not a full evidentiary hearing, on the details, and then the commission made a decision. So I think we tried to balance having a full evidentiary record for something this important, but staying flexible and nimble. That was broadly, I think, appreciated. where did we land? We had a series of rate cases going into our PBR proceeding. We worked with the results of those rate cases as the starting point for our multi-year rate plan. And important to that is, like, as we were going into that, as I alluded to earlier, we hit the COVID pandemic, and the requested increases by the utilities were highly really untenable at that time. And there was a negotiated agreement with the consumer advocate to leave rates as they were going into this 5-year rate plan. The commission itself instituted a management audit. That was controversial in itself, but my colleagues' feeling, we wanted a deep look into the management structure, the organizational structure of the utility before going into this 5-year rate plan. We found significant problems and deficiencies that we embedded into the rates themselves. One of our goals was to create day one savings, and the inefficiencies identified by that management audit were flowed into rates from the beginning. So we were able to move into this process, having downward adjustment to rates based on that, but with a feeling that there was sufficient runway with the approved rate structure and the formula, the elements of the formula to manage that 5-year rate plan. So early results, we did see like a renewed focus on aggressive O&M cost reductions. Utilities actually put out earnings guidance based on what sort of savings they thought they could find. I think that was the first time I'd seen that, at least for a U.S. utility, advertising that to ratings agencies and the investor community. Some of those savings were flowed into customers. So again, there's an example of a win-win opportunity. What we did see is, I think as time went on, we had two major intervening events, and this was the pandemic, and it was the Lahaina fires, and a lot of the changes and new costs that Hawaiian Electric incurred to address that. So I think the next round, the current PBR process is addressing a lot of those new costs, and what we've seen is support continuing for the multi-year rate plan with a renewal of what the current cost structure is. Let's see. I think Josh also asked me to talk about the pilot process that we approved we'd had a history of a lot of innovative companies coming to Hawaii trying to work on clean energy technologies, not a great pilot, approval review process within our commission. So we saw a lot of tension there. So we adopted a framework for a more expedited process, did approve a budget with that. I think there's been mixed results, but my personal feelings, I think this is something that commission, if done well, can be effective, but I think there's still learnings to go through, and I think there's some other better examples throughout the U.S. at the moment. Josh, turn it back to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jay. And I just want to pick up on utility management audits as well. As a former commission staffer, I actually have found them to be really helpful going into a case because it kind of lets you hit the ground running on some of your discovery and where you might kind of dig in more. So just wanted to highlight that as well. Let's move next to Carrie.
I will hit a little bit on process to note that, we had kind of a similar process that was very stakeholder intensive. And then if it's okay, I think I'll reflect upon like lessons learned both in like the second round and just with a little bit of a distance in time from the process. So our process in Illinois was definitely stakeholder intensive, I think like everyone else on this panel, but it's just important to note. We had all kinds of tools we used like through our formal dockets and workshops and technical conferences and written comments and utility filings and stakeholder negotiations. And we had a variety of participants. Again, I think like everyone else on the panel, utilities, consumer advocates, environmental justice organizations, clean energy groups, large load customers and labor. One thing that was perhaps interesting to reflect upon is that we separated the conversation between tracking metrics and then performance metrics. So what I mean by that is the tracking metrics were meant to gather information, establish baselines, improve transparency, and test some of the data quality. There were no direct financial consequences initially. And then the performance metrics were tied to the incentives and penalties and ROE adjustments. Is a great idea, and it's critical, obviously, because we want to kind of talk about the two separately. But in some reflection, there was some tensions that were built because if you monetize some of these immature metrics, you can create kind of endless disputes. So with instead of better outcomes. So it was one way we did it. I'm not sure, how New Jersey's thinking about it in that way, but just something to note. Couple lessons learned that when I reflect upon the first round and learning and reading more about the second round, which has happened since I left the commission. I kind of hit on this, but just to distill the point, what worked best was the reliability metrics. These are operational metrics that are under utility control. So obviously, the idea of setting the utility up for success, some of the easiest stuff is the stuff that they're comfortable with, and that makes a whole lot of sense. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try new things, but I think that's it can maybe an obvious reflection, but important to note. Obviously, it worked best when we had metrics supported by mature data systems. So again, things the utilities are used to, and this is great. Now we have to, I know we're trying to do new things with technologies, things like virtual power plants, which we may not have the sort of data that we would like. But again, this moves to that iterative process. So some of the hardest things that we did in our first round and looking back in reflection was peak reduction. I already talked about this a little bit of why it was hard. It wasn't always in the utilities control. It was hard to have a metric for flexible load and VPPs. Affordability metrics was challenging as well, and anything that was a customer behavioral driven outcome, again, things outside of the control. There are things that the utilities can do to make a customer hopefully be incentivized to behave a certain way, but it's certainly not perfect. And so in reading about what changed in the second round after, again, I had left, there were tougher peak reduction expectations and there were more scrutiny on incremental customer value. So trying to dig down into the actual changes and like the reflecting and how much value the customer got out of it and making sure it's more incremental. There was more tracking metrics before the monetization, and there was a greater emphasis on affordability and broader customer impacts.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Carrie. And last but certainly not least, let's go to Jamie.
Thanks, Josh. So as I mentioned before, when I got to the DPU in Massachusetts, Eversource had just gotten a 5-year rate plan, but we had an opportunity with National Grid and Unitil, our other two EDCs coming in, also asking for 5-year rate plans, similar to the mechanism that Mark described in terms of an annual inflation adjustment, the productivity offset, decoupling, all that. And I was able to send the signal to National Grid before they filed. Look, I know the cool stuff you guys are doing in New York. I know this commission in the past has not looked favorably upon performance incentive mechanisms, PIMs. I think the signals we had sent in the past were not very encouraging of that. I said, I know what you're doing in New York. This is a different commission. This is the direction we'd like to go in. And they filed and asked for, I think, probably 10 different PIMs. We were able to find a couple that we liked. One was megawatts of integration of DERs. Utilities can either make it easy for you to interconnect, or they can make it hard for you to interconnect. But you put some money on the table and you say, we're going to reward you for interconnecting megawatts of DERs. And it was symmetrical, upside, downside, roughly 4 to 5 basis points in terms of the money we were throwing at that. The other was enrolling customers in their low income discount rates, because they had done a great job in that case of designing tiered rates discounts. But the records show that a lot of the eligible customers who were eligible for the low income discount rates were not enrolled. So we did another PIM that said, we're going to reward you for going out there and getting your customers enrolled to take advantage, because obviously energy affordability, energy prices are relatively high in Massachusetts. And it's a big issue. So we've got a solution. You've done a great job of designing a solution. Now get the customers enrolled. And so I think the takeaway was, I would say, rate of return is gonna come up. I would say we were maybe on a little bit of a slightly lower end of where we would have ended up on ROE. But between those two PIMs, they had a chance to make some of that back, I would say, by doing the things that we want to do in terms of aligning policy objectives. We're going to reward you for doing what we want you to do in terms of affordability and clean energy goals. And so I think that's the way I think, and I think we sent the signal, that's the direction we'd like to keep moving. I think it turned out well, but I think just sending that signal that you're open to creative ways of handling these things. Like I say, we do not have the benefit of having a clean slate in Massachusetts. So I'm kind of hitting a moving target. How can we send a signal that this is the direction we'd like to move in terms of encouraging more innovation regarding PIMs that are going to align the utilities' interests with the customer's interests?
And specifically on the PIM for interconnection, DPU also did a great job of pairing that with also getting out some orders that helped unlock more solar development and to change some rules to make the processes run more efficiently. And that was also paired with, and I was in the executive office, some work that we had done with the governor and others to make it really clear to the utilities through executive orders and other actions that interconnection was a priority. So all of those things, I'm really happy to say, I think have really moved the needle on interconnection with National Grid in Massachusetts. All right, so we have about, let's call it 10 minutes left. I want to end with any additional kind of lessons learned that are really, really important for that you want to impart with New Jersey and BPU here before we leave, and any advice that you haven't been able to get to yet. And I want to start this time with Jamie.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, as I mentioned before, this is a tremendous opportunity that you have that's been given to you. I guess a big piece of advice I would give is be innovative, both in how you do things and what you do. I think across the country, there's a pretty strong message out there that we don't think the regulatory model's working very well. The traditional way that we have set rates, the process that we follow are not producing good outcomes for customers. And so I think, I had 2.5 years in Massachusetts. We try to do a lot of things. I really shook things up, I think, when I got there. I heard a lot of times, well, Mr. Chair, we've always done it this way, or Mr. Chair, we've never done it like that before. And I would usually say, thank you for sharing that. Now let me tell you what it is we're going to do, because I think this is an opportunity. I mean, you've got a great governor. She has a mandate to pretty much do a lot of the things that she put in that executive order number 1 and 1 and 2, I guess. And so I think just think creatively about is there a simpler, more streamlined, more nimble process? And then think about creatively about more of a blank slate in terms of let's design some regulatory mechanisms that are gonna work in terms of producing good outcome for customers in terms of advancing clean energy goals, affordability, equity, all those things. So just innovate, just be creative.
Yeah, that's really well said. And it's not necessarily saying, hey, we have to do things differently necessarily, or there might be a good reason for a thing, but think really critically examining everything right now and using this opportunity to think differently, I think is a really great point. Let's go next to Sarah.
Cool. Well, since Jamie covered creativity and innovation, I'll focus more on bread and butter. First is something that I think all of us mentioned today, which is the importance of really robust and iterative stakeholder engagement as you move through this process. Jamie's totally correct. This is an amazing opportunity. So make that process as meaningful and be creative and innovative as you do it to ensure the best outcomes for everybody. I just have one other point, and it applies, I guess, here, but equally across other types of proceedings as well, because this is just something that was really important to me when I was a commissioner. Do whatever you can to place your consumer advocate and interveners on equal footing with the utilities. When as you heard from the Indiana PBR schedule, it's going to be basically every 6 months from here until they stop doing multi-year rate plans. And it's a small staff, and that's a really quick timeline to be doing rate case after rate case after rate case. And putting people on equal footing doesn't mean favoring one over the other, but there are always funding disparities, and usually there's an information asymmetry as well. And when I was a commissioner, I really worked on strengthening our minimum standard filing requirements to require the utilities to submit not just more information, but more useful information in their case in chief. And I worked with our legislature as well to codify those requirements in rate cases and CPCN proceedings as well whenever possible, because nothing is worse than having the utility make its strongest argument on rebuttal. So yeah, stakeholder engagement and even playing field. Good luck, you guys.
That's a fantastic point, Sarah, about equal leveling the playing field is not about, listening to or hearing from the utility less, but making sure that staff understand and have all of the different perspectives and different information that they need in order to make a well-reasoned decision. So that's a fantastic point, Sarah. All right, let's go to Carrie next.
Sure. Great points by both Jamie and Sarah, of course. I'll take a little different spin on answering. So I'll button up with some of the points I've made, but just to, again, distill it down to some bullet points, and then just kind of my closing thought of how I would be thinking about it to make sure that your North Star is in the right place. I've talked about a lot of these things, but just to distill and reflecting upon the first round of PBR versus the second, I would do differently today. I'd add arrearages and bill burden to the affordability metrics in Illinois. I would tie peak reductions more directly to resource adequacy. It's where I started with the conversation. We are in a load growth era. One example obviously is like virtual power plants, a lot of really interesting solutions on that front. I'd use more tracking metrics first. I would invest earlier in data validation and independent evaluation. And then I'd put customer affordability more centrally at the framework. And just pulling on that thread and kind of closing thoughts, I would put affordability and resource adequacy more essentially, using more tracking metrics and strengthening customer protection measures. At the end of the day, the performance-based regulation only succeeds if the customers are demonstrably better off, right? More affordable bills, a more reliable system, and a grid that is more transparent and responsive to the future that it's quickly coming at all of us. So yes, best of luck, and note that we are all here as a resource, either individually or as RAP as an organization, and we're rooting for you. This is really important work that you're undertaking.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. That was a great list of potential additional PIMs. Hopefully everyone was writing that down. Well, great. Well, last but not least, I want to hear, Jay, any parting words of wisdom, particularly since you were able to successfully, land a very comprehensive set of reforms and PBR framework in Hawaii.
Thanks, Josh. My panelists have given great insight here. So I'm going to hit on a few things and close on the positive. So I think yes, I totally agree with the others. Great opportunity here. What I would reinforce or encourage is to be bold. I think as Jamie and others have said, like, you're going to hear all the reasons to do less and go slower. I think the moment calls for smart, nimble, innovative, but still be bold. But importantly, you have other states have done this and are currently doing it or going through reform processes with you. So that you have the benefit of that a lot of us didn't have at that time. So that should give you a lot of opportunities. And I think we talked about that. None of us are perfect. That was my next point, is that perfect is the enemy of much better here. So don't delay, don't keep seeking the other information you don't have. You will need to, again, the moment calls for being decisive here. but being informed and just think about, yeah, the reforms you make here will be iterative and you will, the trajectory is much better than today. And then when the next round comes, even better than that. And I think that was what we were able to achieve, even when we weren't perfect. The triple wins are possible. So I think when people talk about the North Stars, customer outcomes can improve while keeping a stable and sometimes improving regulatory environment, investment environment, and delivering on the public policy outcomes. I think, keeping that is a key goal and not getting pulled into, more of a zero sum thought process about how this would work. Now, again, I would just end on, alluded to it a few times. Ours, my lived and personal experience, we started with a fairly negative perception, not just fairly, we'd had a credit rating downgrade going into our process, a lot of controversy, the way we managed it, how we brought people along, the inclusiveness and the final outcome led to a credit rating upgrade. So that was at least the market's view that we had handled things well. Everything that I see here so far, things that I've seen here today, will all seem to be on that track as well. So I wish you well. And just again, there's opportunity for great upside here and can deliver positive outcome for the residents, folks in your state.
Awesome.
Close there, Josh.
Yeah, no, well, thank you so much. That's a perfect place to end. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Jamie. Please join me in thanking our 4 fantastic former commissioner panelists. All right, so we're going to transition now to the phase of the discussion where we want to really bring you in to the conversation here today and get your perspectives on the different things that we've been talking about. And again, just to remind you all of the questions that we had left you with before the break. The first one is, what are the regulatory goals that you believe should guide BPU's investigation and study, any investigations that come out of that study? What are the priority customer outcomes that should also guide not only that study, but the design of any specific performance-based mechanisms? And then last but not least, what performance-based mechanisms do you believe or would you recommend BPU look to forward because they actually align or would best achieve those goals and outcomes? So we're going to walk through an exercise where we tackle each one of those questions one by one, but I just wanted to start by reminding everyone of the questions. So let's go ahead and put, can everyone on the Zoom see it? Yes. All right. So what we're going to do, put that. So if everyone can take out their phones, hopefully folks are familiar with Mentimeter or other similar polling tools. So use that QR code or go to menti.com and make sure you can log in. And we want to start off with kind of an icebreaker question, make sure Mentimeter is working for everybody. So if you could put in the type of organization that you represent. So are you here from a utility? Are you here from BPU or another state agency? What's your background and what is your interest in this study? All right, we're seeing a few people from the utilities. A few nonprofits, trade organization, government. Right, more from trades and nonprofit. Decent number of BPU and government staff. Storage industry, great. All right, it seems like everyone knows how this works. It's working. We see who we have. I don't think there's any surprises here. All right, so let's get into our questions. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to do another prompt, just like we just did. We'll look at how everyone responded, and then we'll ask folks that want to elaborate on their response to go ahead and find a microphone. Again, give us your name and affiliation and elaborate on your response. So the first question to the group is, what regulatory goals should drive the utility business model reform study the BPU is going to undertake, and importantly, any subsequent investigations that come out of that study? All right, so rate freeze and affordability, which I would kind of put together. Reliability, interconnection. I think we know that Executive Order 1 specifically called out interconnection timelines is a potential option for a PIM. See, clean energy, efficiency, predictability is one that I saw, although it's getting smaller. I think we've heard that a little bit. Fairness, we heard a question about that earlier. Does anyone, that's particularly around affordability and maybe reliability, anyone want to elaborate on their comments? Please, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Brian Lippman from the Division of Rate Counsel. I think it's important when we're talking about affordability that there's actually bills are going down. What I'm hearing a lot about affordability today is, how are we going to help low-income people pay their bills? How are we going to help people afford their bills? The bottom line is, to quote the guy from New York City, our bills are too damn high. And we need to do something about bringing the bills under control. And quite frankly, I haven't seen anything yet today that talks about affordability in the context of controlling bills, reducing bills. That doesn't seem to be what we're talking about. And I think we need to talk about what affordability means before we start talking about how we address affordability.
Yeah, thank you so much for that important comments. Please go ahead.
Hi, Mara Collins-Grew with New Jersey Citizen Action. Brian, that's exactly what I wanted to say. And I just want to add to that, none of the panelists that we heard from, and there's a lot of great information, talked about any cost savings. There was no reduction. And I think we have to level set here. We're in a crisis where people can't pay their bills. And we're not just talking low income people. We're talking the highest rates people have ever had. They can't sustain it. And it's in an atmosphere where we're seeing fiscal challenges across every sector. So I put rate reduction because affordability has to start there because of where we are today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And understanding the context that everyone's living in right now is so important. So thank you for that. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Katie Reaver. I'm with IGS Solar. First, I wanted to thank the BPU for this arena, this sort of stakeholder engagement. It's fantastic. I would say that increasing the utilization of utility assets and allowing distributed resources to be deployed in a way that the utilities don't necessarily have to build new poles and wires, but we can improve the overall utilization of their existing assets.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think probably, as you know, and others know, if you're able to achieve that, you use those existing assets and spread those costs out over more customers, there is the potential to lower rates, right? So that is, those two things, at least in my mind, I see as interconnected. Please go ahead.
I'm Lyle Rawlings with the Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Industries Association. In the list of objectives this morning, we didn't hear the word clean, but it was refreshing to hear Jay Griffin put that right up front and center. We're in a time where we need to reassess the tie between distributed resources, especially solar and storage, the tie between that and affordability. Current analysis is showing that solar, for instance, can be not only the quickest, but one of the most effective ways to increase affordability and drive down rates. I believe we also have to look at consumer costs that lay outside their bills, and the clean energy and climate change is a very strong driver to future costs that are external to bills, but still hit people very hard.
Yeah, Great point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is Shihab Karan from Power Edison in New Jersey. Thank you for convening the group today. I think there was a question about affordability. What is affordability? And amongst all the definitions, I like what Tom Friedman used in his book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, that affordability, when it comes to energy and renewable energy, it's okay that the cost per kilowatt hour is high, but that we use few kilowatt hours. So effectively, if you, through policy or other behavior, artificially reduce the cost of kilowatt hour, then you're removing incentives for the private sector to react. You're removing incentives for consumers or rate users to drive the right behavior. And we've seen it in other countries where, let's say, electricity is heavily subsidized. That's one way of, kind of tax the certain brackets of society and artificially reduce the bill, but that can drive the wrong behavior for society and for consumers. Our grid in the US is about 41% utilized. But that means we can effectively deliver almost 2 times, maybe more than 2 times the amount of energy with the same grid if we get to shave that peak or deliver the power that's commensurate with the shape of how we can push energy through. So peak shaving, for example, is a very obvious target when it comes to affordability. Peak shaving, the best megawatt is a negawatt, is a megawatt that we negate from the system. So I want to go back to the definition of affordability. We live in the state of New Jersey. It's one of the top in the country in terms of income per capita. So when you have high income per capita, we demand certain standard of living, certain, like my friend Lyle mentioned, renewable energy. But we know, for example, if we need a lot of solar, it's obvious to everyone, we're not, you don't have to be a scientist, that solar energy in New Jersey is not the best when it compared to, say, the Southwest, but we demand it. So affordability can still mean high cost per kilowatt hour, but far fewer kilowatt hours that show up on the bill. Thank you.
And just real quick, I want to make sure, because I want to summarize a few of your points to make sure I'm getting this right. So it sounds like really you're emphasizing the importance of price signals to customers and to private industry, as well as which implicates rate design, right? What's actually how customers are charged for things, really with the objective of making sure we're using resources, including infrastructure and generation, as efficiently and effectively as possible. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a specific example. I personally have been involved in this process for almost 20 years. I know my friend Lyle as well and many others. We've helped author the Energy Master Plan, served on governor's transition teams for energy and environment. So this is not the first gathering, frankly, for the same objectives. But here we are, year after year, we show up and kind of as if the problem is a new one. It's not a new one. So New Jersey has deep resources when it comes to innovation, and innovation doesn't have to be in the lab. You can have innovation at policy level, at so many programs, whether they're taxpayer driven or ratepayer driven. Give you a specific example. We today at Power Edison build the world's largest mobile batteries that utilities around the country use for affordability and resiliency. So there are tools that don't have to be invented again that can address affordability and resilience at the same time. So I think I just general comment that we have actionable things that we can do, and kind of comment to everyone is to be less political. I've seen it happen in other places, whether outside the US or inside. Let's look at the data, be data driven, and luckily we have a lot of solutions that are very effective today.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for that. I also want to create some space. We've heard a little bit about, more than a little bit about already affordability, how we define that, how we think about that. That obviously is kind of the primary focus at the moment, again, understandably. Just want to create space for, are there any other comments around affordability. I also see equity and transparency. Any other comments around those topics that people want to raise? The other kind of collection I see is clean energy and interconnection. I know, as I mentioned earlier, interconnection is specifically called out in Executive Order 1, paragraph 7 for this study. Anything around that that folks want to share? For folks online, there's someone walking to the mic. That's why we're waiting.
Hey, Josh. Yeah, Ed Rowland, RWE. Really appreciated all the conversation from the various former commissioners, and especially what Carrie said about the issues that are exogenous to the utility being included in PIMS, right? It ought to be that anybody is measured on what they can control, not what they can't control. We deal with that from industry's perspective in a lot of instances. And I know that last year there was an order promulgated that required more queue transparency and a much improved interconnection queue, as well as reporting with regard to interconnection performance. But what I would definitely encourage the board in this endeavor is to require the utilities to go back and look prior to that so that we have more historical information as it relates to what the utilities performance actually has been in advance of setting any kind of PIMS around this. We had this challenge in Colorado recently where Xcel basically was proposing a PIM that would have given them a bunch of money for doing exactly what they've been doing for the last number of years. So I think that we need to inform this endeavor with as much information as possible, even if that requires additional analysis and work beyond what has already been promulgated by order.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ed, about designing PIMS around what you want to see, not what's already happening. All right, so let's move to customer outcomes. What specific customer outcomes do you think should be prioritized in any utility business model reform? And I meant to start us out with this, and I actually, if you don't mind, Taryn, we have in the front of the room, and we can hand out some examples from other states. They're illustrative. So if you're struggling for examples to pull from, we have examples from Hawaii and Connecticut that you can pull from. Again, they're illustrative, not saying that that's necessarily even best practice, but there are some examples for you to pull from either now or if you want to take that handout at the end of the day. All right, so we're hearing lower bills. We heard that in the room. Well, do not want to use my widgets. Customer service is one that we've seen as well. Better reliability. We heard the former commissioners talk a lot about that. In terms of transparency, I'm curious for anyone that raised that topic, if you wouldn't mind, specifically, what is the outcome associated with transparency that you would encourage BPU to think about, and how would we kind of measure success there?
Hi, I'm Dina Matola with New Jersey Citizen Action. I was just thinking about how the ratepayers often don't understand what the rate increase is for and don't have information to evaluate or get a good analysis of whether it was just prudent, if the profits were excessive for the utility company, just, it was just too high and it wasn't warranted. And I would just want to offer, as we begin this process, that I think there's not a lot of consumer advocates in the room. Like you just heard Citizen Action twice already. I don't know if anyone else is here representing consumers, especially low-income consumers. And I would definitely encourage, if we're going to achieve these pro-consumer outcomes, that there be more inclusion of the consumer advocates in the process. That's talking to the governor's office, talking to the BPU. I know the utilities have been having a lot of meetings. Obviously, they're important in the process, but so are the consumers and the consumer advocates. So I think, like, if we're going to arrive at the right place, we're not yet inside having the conversation with you. We appreciate being here today, and we will keep coming, but also, in an ongoing way, being engaged. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think your first point about customer education and transparency. There's honestly just some very basic things that Massachusetts, some other states have done in recent years, just with having kind of road shows to explain the process to folks, updated websites that walk through some of those things, and understanding executive summaries on orders. I'm not as familiar with BPU orders, so maybe you guys already do executive summaries, but just making sure and adding little things here and there to make sure the information that the commissions across the country are, have at their disposal about their orders and other, utility operations is explained in a way that's more accessible to all customers. So that was a great point. Please.
I'm going to follow exactly on what you're talking about. Rich Henning for the New Jersey Utilities Association. I spent 10 years as a councilman in Park Ridge, and I can't tell you how many folks would come into the council meetings and, talk about a 1% raise in their town taxes when, we actually had school taxes that we collected, we had county taxes that we collected, and we had municipal taxes. And we always gave a big pie chart so they could actually see the breakdown of their tax dollars. And I was thinking, just as we're talking about reliability, we should be talking about education, consumer education, because it's really going to be probably the most important aspect as you endeavor to move to PBRs and everything else. We love acronyms, right? Because when I was in college, PBR was Pabst Blue Ribbon, right? But it's not anymore. I guess PBR is performance best rate. So what I do want to make sure is that whatever is done here, not just being transparent, but we're open and we're actually publicizing and talking about this, because the utility bill is probably one of the most difficult bills for a customer to ever endeavor to understand. And when they see all the different charges, whether it's, the special benefits charge or, the charge that's going to come from their actually energy consumption versus, the energy production charge, it's very difficult for them to understand that. So I think, and utilities right now, our bills are regulated, the way they look are regulated. There's a lot of things on the bill that we have to put on there. But I think a simpler way to basically do that, whether we go to a consumer type bill, which would be nice and easier, pick one of your stores that you like, pick your MasterCard that has all the different charges listed so you can go right down the line. We've got to simplify what we do. And I know that's probably the hardest thing, but we have to simplify and educate. And that's going to be really key to making sure the customers understand this entire process.
That's a great point. And I will say too, just from my experience in other jurisdictions that have clarified on the bill and bucketed costs to make it easier to understand, that also does need to be paired with, again, based on my experience, with customer education. Because if you bucket those things, customers are going to make assumptions about those buckets, and it actually might further misunderstanding in other directions. So you just have to make sure that you're pairing anything you do there that does enhance transparency or can with customer education to make sure people do still understand the nuance and can have access to understanding nuance at the level that is appropriate for them. All right. Any other let's see, we've heard already a little bit about clean energy, but again, if there's any other kind of specific outcomes folks would like to highlight on clean energy, would invite you to provide those comments. Anyone online wants to add on to their comments? No? All right. We can keep it moving. All right, so what, oh, please, go ahead. Yep.
Andy Wall with Core Renewables. We're a solar storage developer. I guess just one point I wanted to make. I don't envy sometimes the BPU here because they have a regulatory job. They're regulating monopolies and then the solar industry, which is a pretty vibrant, competitive marketplace. And I think the principles are very different when you think about these two things. So with a solar industry, my own theory of regulation is focus on supply side issues, focus on market concentration, these things to try to lower cost. I think of interconnection as such a supply side issue. If we increase the supply of interconnection capacity, we have the ability to lower cost.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, particularly in a time where can be difficult to build other generations. So it's a really great point. Please.
Steve Goldenberg, I represent the New Jersey Large Energy Users Coalition, so I guess I am a consumer advocate as well. I also wanted to talk about the transparency aspect of this, although obviously we're concerned about everything that's up there. I am heartened by the process that you describe here, because my initial thought was it's really imperative that we give these issues the attention that they deserve. As one of the elder statesmen in the room here, I guess, I went through the restructuring of the electric and gas industry, and I can tell you how much time we spent on unbundling rates and all new visions about how things should be done. And while I don't think this goes to quite that level, it's analogous to it. And the transparency concerns that I have, I think, go deeper than explaining to customers what the bills are. We have intervened in every rate case, every infrastructure case that's been convened by the board. I have signed my share of non-disclosure agreements in connection with those. My concern goes to, it is really important that as part of this process, people like Brian, like Dina and I, assuming, whatever confidentiality attends to that, be given access to what you're talking about. Because what these commissioners have been talking about occurred in a different time period. And I frankly see a lot of spending going on going forward. And if you're talking about future rates and projecting, what we'll be spending 5 years from now, that's a real wild card. And I don't think we've had a particularly great track record in predicting future costs. I mean, 3 months ago, if anybody predicted the price of oil, where would that prediction be today? So it's inherently difficult to get to those true numbers. There was a reference made to information asymmetry. I think that is a huge issue. And it's really important that people like us be given full opportunity to vet those numbers because there is a danger here. And I'm not saying these things because I don't support what you're doing. I do. But it's important to get this right, because if we don't get it right, we've seen examples from other states. I've been reading up on the experience of a number of states. Some get it right, some don't, but the ones that don't get it right have the exact opposite effect of lowering bills. So I welcome the process, happy to participate in it. I just wanted to share those thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for those important comments. Please.
I think this was maybe from earlier, but it came up, so I just want to make sure we get it out. From Jeffrey Grant, who's participating via Zoom, referring to the pie chart that Bob Brabson shared earlier, appreciating that we are only just addressing the distribution here today, around 19%, and clean energy and policy is 9%. What we need is transparency about the cost of all the RECs that are paid through BGS service. At present, they are around 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour and not transparent. They will accelerate immensely as we develop more renewable resources towards 100% carbon-free electricity. Why can't we show these costs as separate line items and have third-party suppliers provide a line item to everyone to be honest about what green energy costs?
Great. Yeah, thank you for reading that. Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted that point got me thinking, and to add to Steve's point about transparency, I think it's also important because, again, the prior commenter online made the point that we're talking about the distribution portion of the bill, in our case, roughly, a third of the bill. And I think managing the public's expectation, given the fact that what has driven a lot of the affordability challenges here and elsewhere in the country is the supply side of the bill, and the lack of supply to meet demand, that I think we need to be cautious about creating expectations that bills will be lower than they were previously, because of business model changes. We can make things more predictable, more transparent, and do some of those kind of things. But ultimately, customers need to recognize that what's been driving the affordability challenges that we're all dealing with are primarily on the supply side of the bill, and that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's an important reminder that this utility business model reform is just one piece of the overall affordability work that's going on here in New Jersey. All right, so let's get into, so specifically what we're gonna do with the next three polls is we pulled from both Connecticut and Hawaii, and again, I can't say this enough, just illustrative examples that had publicly available customer outcomes that were a part of their PBR framework, specifically around utility operations. So you'll have the opportunity to assign points to each one of these, and just want to start to talk with more precision about which of these specific customer outcomes that were identified in Hawaii and Connecticut are most important, in your opinion, for BPU to try and achieve here in this state. So we have at the top business model operations efficiency and investment efficiency, utility cost control, comprehensive and transparent system planning, which Mark talked a little bit about earlier, distribution system utilization, that's come up several times today, reliable and, oh, now it switched on me, great. Reliable and resilient electric service, and, oh yeah, the last one was DER asset effectiveness. All right, so we're seeing essentially service quality come to the top so far. All right, anyone want to speak to, I think reliability is pretty clearly come to the top, at least with this group. Are there any, does anyone want to speak to that? Why did you kind of vote that one the highest? One. Yeah, I was gonna say, if you're gonna look at me and ask whether or not you should comment, the answer is yes.
Brian Lippman from Rate Council again. I think reliability is at the top because at the end of the day, that's what customers are paying for. And I would say on top of the biggest complaint, which lately has been my bill is too high, one of the biggest complaints we get is why are we not getting service? Why is service always being interrupted? And so, and my coupled with my bill is so high and I still can't get electric service 24 hours a day. What is going on here? What do I have to do to get that service? And why am I paying this bill? So I think that's why you're seeing reliability so high. And I'm not going to name one EDC or another, but everybody's special in their own special ways. And some of them, quite frankly, are not producing the reliability that I think we need in the state right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it becomes a value question, right? What am I paying for if my bill's so high and I don't feel like I have reliable service? It's a great point. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Eric Miller with Evergreen Action. I'll just say really briefly, appreciate the thoughtfulness that's gone into this stakeholder meeting. This is a really complex topic, and so I think taking the time to work through everything has been really valuable. I'll combine reliable and resilient electric service, I think, with a couple things on that list, including distributed energy resource effectiveness. The state of New Jersey over the past almost 10 years at this point has done a really good job in building out a lot of different verticals of resources, whether it's AMI, posting capacity maps for solar, the solar programs, more recently, the concurrent docket on virtual power plants and distributed storage. And there's all of these resources that the state is investing in and that customers are utilizing, and that there's a lot of penetration on the grid in New Jersey, and having a PBR framework that really thinks about how to roll those together to derive value for customers directly, derive value for utilities, and get at to the comment, we're talking about the distribution side here. If we could thread that needle and find a way to layer in interconnection, virtual power plants, peak demand reduction programs all together, we can get at that other side of the bill also. And so I think keeping that front and center is a really big opportunity for the state. So happy that it was raised and looking forward to see how it develops.
Yeah, it's a great point about making sure to co-optimize existing assets on the grid, right? To better leverage that to create value and where possible, reduce rates. I think we've seen in the UK that's kind of where their model is headed is really optimizing the distribution system, including all of the things that are connected to it. So that's a great point. Please.
I'll speak to the second point about distribution system utilization, and I'll put on my electrical engineering hat. So there's a study that shows that the top 1% of the peak hours is responsible for 8% of the total cost. 1% to 8, meaning there's an 8x multiplier for the top hours. And the top 10% of the peak hours is responsible for 40% of the total cost. So really, it's a nonlinear system that gets really expensive at the top hours. So data tells us go and attack the top 1 and the top 10% of the peak. Now, we can do this through price signals, and price signals will require the full participation of utilities and rate case stakeholders. So in New Jersey, for example, we needed to send price signals to every ratepayer. That includes residential customers. In order to do that, you would have needed a smart meter that can tell when the load is happening and thus can interact with the load. But in New Jersey, if you go back historically, you'll see that New Jersey resisted for many, many years to allow the utilities to install smart meters, even though it was so obvious that in order to drive behavior and reduce the peak, we need such smart equipment. So I would say back to that comment earlier about that we can push over twice the energy through the system by shaving that peak. I would invite everyone to really focus on that peak, bring it down. It will bring cost down, will bring affordability, and actually makes the system much more reliable.
Great, thank you.
Yes, Ed Brolin, RWE again. I'd like to combine a couple of these, Josh, and first of all, fantastic use of Menti. Best I've ever seen. Great. But I think we can combine 2, 3, 5, and 6 really within the context of the comment of what has already been paid for, right? We've paid for all of this infrastructure. What are we getting for it? And if we can do things like flexible interconnection, like asset utilization, we can actually realize benefit from already existing infrastructure. But then the number one thing that I'm most excited about in terms of the opportunity is actually the comprehensive and transparent system planning. Right, we're doing this in Massachusetts with the Electric Sector Modernization Plan. Here in New Jersey, we have the PSUP. We've got the CGPP in New York. I can do the acronyms all day long. But at the end of the day, the president opened today's, meeting saying certainly some money is going to need to be spent. A lot of money has been spent, and we should maximize the benefit that we can derive from what has been spent, and we are nowhere near what we could do in that area. But when we're thinking about the money that needs to be spent going forward to upgrade our distribution system, we need to do it in the most effective and efficient way possible, and that needs to be done through stakeholder processes like these and all these kinds of conversations. But I think that a lot of these things are interrelated as expected, and I think that the asset utilization conversation is really front and center in that.
Yeah, this part of that. That's a great point about connecting the dots there, and thanks for highlighting some of those other best practices from other neighboring jurisdictions. All right, last call for anyone want to make a pitch for any of the ones that are lower down that haven't been talked about yet. Utility cost control, asset effectiveness. All right, so that was customer outcomes related to utility operations. So now I want to talk through, again, we just pulled these from Hawaii and Connecticut to give us something to talk around as illustrative examples. Which of these customer outcomes related to customer experience are most important, in your opinion, for New Jersey to really have front and center. So we have affordability, interconnection experience, quality customer service, customer empowerment, and customer equity. All right, so not all that surprisingly, we're seeing affordability come to the top, but we're also seeing well, okay, now it changed, but we're, customer empowerment there for a while was co-equal. I'm curious if, at least in my mind, I see affordability and customer empowerment very interrelated, as that empowerment can actually help customers take more control over their bills and make them more affordable. I'm curious if there's anyone that did vote for customer empowerment, if you have any comments to kind of build on your thoughts there.
Mike Winka, I don't represent anybody, I'm just a simple ratepayer. One of the usual suspects on DREG 1 along with Steve, so yeah, so I can buy my services from the market, but I can't sell my services to the market. That's what I want through the utilities, and you have to do that through the utilities. So that's my customer empowerment. I want to be able to sell my services back to the market. Then you can eliminate some of the incentives that we have to pay and lower cost. We empower people and we educate people. The more people that play in the market, the more they understand it, the more they can help shape the market. So that's why I voted for customer empowerment.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm George Kutsaratis. I'm with Bryan Electric. We specialize with a lot of EV chargers. And I might have skewed it a little bit, but I put 50 and 50 on those two. I think one of the biggest things, as being someone who's boots on the ground dealing with customers daily, is you've got two fronts. You've got solar, that a single family home, sure, they can put solar on the roof, but it's limited to what their current use is. We're not thinking about, well, they want to electrify, they want to get their EVs, they want to get all electric HVAC. And so if they're midway through their journey of electrification, you're going to limit their solar just to what they're at that point, and not even considering the fact that over a 30-year span, solar panel degradation will happen, which will make it worse. So it's great how we're at net metering and we're at a net neutral at that present moment when they first install, but we're not permitting them, we're not giving them the accessibility to think beyond, to move beyond it. And then the other biggest point that I want to bring up is vehicle to grid integration, right? So obviously we know right now in New Jersey, we're making big strides for electrification of vehicles. There's over 250,000 EVs in New Jersey alone. If you take the average battery size, that's 16 gigawatts of battery storage available that we are not tapping into. It is available from the hardware. It is available from the software. It requires the policy making. It requires the integration, which is what I would believe this room and everyone involved is very capable of figuring out to make finally a reality. Europe has done it. Parts of Massachusetts has done it. Seattle has done it. We can do it. We know it's there, and we're not reinventing the wheel here. But it's as simple as saying, you have your home, you have your EV, even utility-owned vehicle to grid. There's an opportunity for curbside chargers that could even contribute back to the grid. These options are available. We just got to figure out exactly how we make that happen. But I think the time for that is now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think a good example of at least the potential of EVs to provide, services and electricity to the grid, and also as a resiliency benefit. New England has, different states have different standalone storage behind the meter programs, and EVs on an individual basis provide way more capacity right, than a standalone battery. So it's just an example of maybe there's something there that could be co-optimized. So I appreciate that comment. All right, one last opportunity for anyone. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Darren.
We have Anna Johnson from ACEEE. A comment with regard to customer empowerment is that requiring utilities to continue to run robust efficiency programs supports customers in having tools available to directly cut their energy usage through efficiency upgrades and reduce their bills.
Right. Any other comments? We've seen, I know customer equity is at kind of the bottom of the rankings, but we did see it come up earlier in regulatory goals. I'm curious if there's anything more that folks want to comment on there. Okay. All right, let's go to the last slide on customer outcomes. So specifically, and equity comes up again here. These are the public policy and how we define public policy is all in the eye of the beholder. But at least this is how Connecticut and Hawaii had defined it. And these are customer outcomes related to broader societal outcomes and government and state policy objectives that were important in those jurisdictions. So we're curious how how important these are here in New Jersey. So again, reliability, customer social equity, GHG emission reductions, and then specifically in Hawaii, there is an outcome related to transportation electrification that was identified. All right, we've talked about reliable and resilient service a few times already. So anyone want to speak to greenhouse gas emissions reductions being explicitly called out as a priority outcome in a goals outcomes hierarchy? I didn't think anyone was going to move there for a second, and I was going to be genuinely shocked.
The benefit of being closer than Lyle. Hey again, Eric Miller, Evergreen Action. I think, and this goes beyond New Jersey, and I do think one of the commissioners mentioned this, that the context of the first round of PBRs was kind of in the flat load era, which we were all in for 20 years, and now we're in, I don't know, the load growth era. I guess we could all decide what to name it in a couple years. But the focus on affordability, reliability, resilient service is incredibly important, should not go away, should be a primary consideration. But in doing so, there definitely should not be kind of a backsliding from New Jersey's effort to curb greenhouse gas emissions. The state has been very successful in doing so. The in-state generation that New Jersey has is barely clean relative to other states. I'm sure folks who watch the larger PJM region recently saw that Governor Shapiro is working on a consent decree to keep 3.5 gigawatts of coal on in Western Pennsylvania. So we should be taking steps through this process again to leverage the generation that we have in state, and a lot of it happens to be distributed. Energy efficiency, the other things that are available to us to continue to drive that GHG reduction. We also know and have already seen from actions in New Jersey that the state can move fairly quickly to get hundreds of megawatts of storage online faster than we can get other sources of generation online. Certainly the nuclear fleet in New Jersey is something that has a lot of conversation as well. We do not need to be overly reliant on out-of-state, dirtier sources of energy just in the name of affordability. And frankly, I don't know whether keeping 3.5 gigs of Pennsylvania coal online is going to bend that curve on the supply side. So I think GHG emission reductions can move lockstep with a lot of the other policy goals we're trying to accomplish here. I don't think we should start from a place that, hey, we kind of need to take a break on this and go work on other stuff. I think we can keep it front and center and still be successful with the other public policy goals.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that.
Lyle Rawlings, Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Industries Association. Eric stole some of my thunder, but in a good way. Two points in two areas. The first is the urgency of greenhouse gas reductions. This is shaping up to be a banner year for climate harm. I would urge people to go and look up just from the last 2 weeks, the news about the AMOC. If you don't know what that is, please look it up, but alarm bells ringing all over the place on that. Or the news this week of what scientists are saying are 100% chance of a super El Nino this year, which will be the highest on record for the last 150 years. So the urgency is growing, and this year in particular. The second point is, fortunately, the same things that the state can do to most effectively fight climate change are the most effective they can do to impact affordability. Our analysis right now is tracking where solar has a value, according to our analysis, just in the market reductions in the PJM region, coupled with the social cost of carbon, with $15 of return for every dollar invested in incentives. A 15-to-1 return is pretty spectacular. And as Eric mentioned, the fastest way to get capacity online. A similar thing can be said about storage, and the state is beginning to undertake a distributed storage program. Again, it will be the fastest and most effective way to add new capacity and reduce capacity charges. Solar, of course, does three things in PJM. It addresses the capacity costs, it addresses the transmission costs, and the largest of all, the energy cost in the wholesale cost. So these are effective on both sides, greenhouse gas and affordability.
Great, thank you so much. I think there was one comment before you. Yeah, there we go.
Hi there, Tori Geisler from JCP&L. And I am going to make these remarks without regard to judgment calls on any of the policy issues that we're talking about here. But I think that it needs to be said that while all laudable goals, to be thinking about advancing all of those at scale during a period where we hear affordability being thought of as something that is to be defined as decreasing rates is concerning to me in representing a utility, because the fact is we do control so very little the portion of the bill that is ours. And so much else of the bill component is not ours and is used to fund those policy goals and all sorts of other things that we can't control. And so I think that in returning to one of your first questions, defining what affordability means, I think we need to have some very difficult conversations with ourselves about what we can achieve, what we care to achieve first and foremost, and whether those things can coincide with reducing or keeping customer bills stable, because all of these things cost money. And it's great to talk about them and suggest that they can be done at the same time that you're reducing customer bills. But when you're not in charge of that bill, I think that's a very easy thing to say. And I have yet to be convinced that is the case in the context of so much else happening outside of the rate case that it gets injected onto our bills. And I think it's also a really important thing to talk about how we move through this process, because we heard the ex-commissioner from Hawaii talking about what happened to the utilities credit ratings when this happened. And if you're not used to dealing with those things, that is a really critical impact for us to avoid here, because that type of impact, if we don't move through this the right way, is going to be the sort of thing that affects customer bills, whether folks realize it or not, because that affects the cost of debt at which we're securing the capital to advance every one of these policy goals. And so totally agree with advancing all of them, but being thoughtful about which ones are must-haves right now and at what pace, while also thinking about reducing customer bills and whether that's actually a realistic goal. So
yeah, Well, thank you so much for all those comments. Just two quick things. Just want to be want to make sure we're really clear about in Hawaii. I appreciate the reiteration of Jay's point. And actually, they were successful in implementing those reforms and then actually resulted in HECO's credit rating going up afterwards. So I just want to make sure that was clear to everybody. But I do think it's a really important and fair point about setting realistic and reasonable expectations amongst everyone at the outset. So, and I think we've heard that from others as well. So thank you for raising that. And I'm going to cap it at these two comments, and then we have one last Mentimeter poll to do, and then we can wrap up today. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So I would like to address transportation electrification, even though it showed up at the bottom on the screen. Affordability, which is kind of the banner subject for today's meeting. If we look at New Jerseyans, affordability extended not just to the bill, but also the mode of transportation and gasoline price in the last few months. And so this is one of the few items where it can really check the box on 3 or 4, maybe 5 benefits from an affordability, reliability, utilization perspective. One, we all know that cost per mile for electric vehicles is significantly lower than ICE vehicles. So that is an affordability item, even though it looks like could be a greenhouse gas reduction or some other metric, it really is an affordability item as well. Second, myself, my college kids, we drive electric vehicles and we follow PSE&G's incentive program where you charge overnight, you get few cents off per kilowatt hours. So we are participating as a family in increasing the utilization of the grid at night. And enhanced utilization, as all the studies show, will help with affordability in general because we're getting more out of our grid. Third, the gentleman from Bryan Electric mentioned a fantastic point, and I know Kathleen Lewis of the BPU has been championing this, is how about vehicle to grid? Or starting with vehicle to load, V2L, and then V2G. I personally have over 300 kilowatt hours of battery storage connected at home that is not tapped into, not utilized. That could be of significant value if those electrons can find their way back to the grid during peak hours. Most of the time, the car is parked, it's not being used. Cars on the average get used less than 4% of their time, by the way. So transportation electrification, while it might show up at the bottom of the list here, can really help the grid affordability, resilience, and greenhouse gases in New Jersey. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Andy Wall, Core Renewables. I just wanted to address one point about the structure of the bill, that of distribution and wholesale power costs. I think it's well recognized that wholesale power costs are a very strong driver of affordability right now. And I take some of the point that our utilities are not in control of wholesale power costs. However, one of our primary tools in the state to address wholesale power costs is to deploy more and more distributed resources. And the ability to interconnect is a primary impediment to achieving that goal. So I think that our EDCs, our utilities, do have a lot of control over wholesale power costs through that indirect mechanism.
Great, thank you for that. All right, last Mentimeter poll. So the question, and this one you can actually write in your response, is which of the PBR mechanisms that we've discussed today do you think are vital to achieving the regulatory goals and the outcomes that we've just been talking about for the better part of the last hour? And again, if you need help, we have the handouts, there's a list. Also, paragraph 7 of Executive Order 1 is a pretty good list in and of itself. All of them. Okay. All right. So any of the specific mechanisms, so say multi-year rate plans, some of the high level discussions we've had about finding ways to ensure that capital intensive solutions are levelized with solutions that might be more of an operating expense, performance incentive mechanisms, any of those, right? I'm seeing multi-year rate plan or MYP coupled with symmetric PIMs. PIMs for interconnecting DERs, grid utilization. For the folks that said grid utilization, anything specific there? Are we talking about a PIM? Are we talking about a metric? Any thoughts on that, or just grid utilization in general? All right. Totex, anyone that said Totex want to elaborate on that more? Help educate everyone on what that means? Yeah, 30 seconds, exactly. I got 14 minutes. Anyone, just at a very high level, Totex is mentioned earlier, trying to find ways to, at least from the utilities investment perspective, levelize capital solutions versus solar and storage, for example, which for them is a pass-through expense if a third party is providing that solution. So figuring out ways from a financial perspective to levelize those things. Totex is one way in which you can go about doing that. It's been implemented in the United Kingdom. No one in the US has yet implemented it here, although several jurisdictions have looked into it. All right. Oh, okay, that's helpful. Please, yeah, go ahead.
Tall was up here. So Dina from Citizen Action again. So this isn't actually answering the question, but I just, at some point today, wanted to say I was a little surprised that the entire stakeholder meeting was all set around PBR, because from the consumer advocate point of view, there's ways that model, regardless of which tools within the toolbox you use, could not be pro-consumer and could be more like a utility profit protection. And so I just want to offer that there's other ways you can address high rates, if that's kind of one of the reasons that all this discussion around reform is happening, that I would have preferred to come into this process with more options on the table where PBR was one, and then there were others as well that would be discussed. So I didn't anticipate that, and I just saw that when the agenda popped out, I think I saw it yesterday. I was very surprised to see that a lot had already, like that the focus had been narrowed already to PBR without taking input on the other options.
Sure. Do you mind, just real quick, can you speak to some of those other options that you were hoping would be on the table?
Yeah, I mean, some of them could be within a PBR model, but we could just more directly look at rate of equity. We could look at alternative ways to get capital to invest in our energy infrastructure. And again, all of those things could be done through PBR, but I think that they all deserved a full conversation of
Yeah.
their own.
No, thank you. And I think it sounds like there's going to be additional stakeholder engagement opportunities. We actually we cut down our slides for time. We have a list of PBR and PBR adjacent efforts that can be undertaken, and all of those things are on that list. So maybe we can add it back into the appendix to make it clear. But go ahead, Mark, were you going to add anything? Thanks, Mark. Good. All right. I do think it speaks to the last comment's point of you can do multi-year rate plans well, or you can do them poorly. I think Mark mentioned that earlier. The devil's in the details on literally all of these things. So doing it thoughtfully and with the outcomes and goals that you want to achieve in mind is going to be really important to the success of any of this or anything that we didn't discuss today. Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
Jake Sneeden with Atlantic City Electric. I think MYPs have popped up a lot, and I think it goes back to probably all of the previous mentee slides we looked at with all the competing priorities and all the folks who came up and spoke to say, hey, here's what I think it should look like. Here's what I think is important. I think MYPs give us the framework to actually have that conversation and come to some alignment before the utilities are making investments. And it gives us all that framework to have that discussion and have that alignment. Otherwise, I think we end up with a lot of competing priorities and no one's happy. And maybe in this case, no one's happy, but everyone had their voice heard, and we get and a little bit of the pie gets served to everyone. And that framework happens with multi-year rate plans, and then we can further sort of dive down into the key areas, key priorities using the PIMS model. I think that makes sense. And so that's why, we see that popping up a lot here, I think.
Great, thank you. And I will say, just to your point of putting everything in one place so everyone can understand the trade-offs and make sure planning is being done comprehensively, that's something that not through a multi-year rate plan, but actually through an electric sector modernization plan that was done in Massachusetts. It's difficult. The more mechanisms you create, the more kind of siloed you can be. But one effort that's being undertaken in Massachusetts right now is finding ways to bring that all together so we are co-optimizing and not talking about things in silos. All right, last comment.
Last comment, just to reiterate, again, Rich Henning from New Jersey Utilities Association. Multi-year rate plans are not the panacea, but it is a great step forward. We see regionally that multi-year, if we look to our neighbors to the north in New York, they've had them for many years. I can tell you from a customer point of view, and I had great dealings with them in the Rockland and Westchester County area, that multi-year rate plans, when done correctly, are efficient. But they allow both for, a spreading of costs in terms of customers, but it also allows the planning cycle to be utilized very effectively as well over whether you're going to do 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years. So certainly from an NJUA perspective, we're very supportive of moving forward and looking at multi-year rate plans. We sat here, we sat 2 years ago at our conference and we're discussing them. But there didn't seem to be much of an appetite, let's just say 24 months ago. So we're very, very excited to see it as part of the potential for the planning for the future.
Great.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for participating in the Mentimeter and for everyone that spoke. I want to turn it over with the last couple of minutes to Bob again to talk us through the next steps in this docket in the BPU study.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for facilitating today. Thanks, RAP, for a great job helping us get ready. Thanks, Jay, and the former commissioners. Really appreciate them sharing their perspective and speaking freely. And it's great to have lessons from other states. That's really what this is all about for us to try and figure out what we're going to do next. So we've got some sort of roadmaps up on the board for immediate next steps. As Terrence said, written comments are welcome. They can be submitted hopefully pretty easily through our portal, the public comment tool. We mentioned earlier today that E3 has been retained to be our consultant in this matter. We will be having our kickoff with them very shortly. The utilities especially can expect to see initial round of data requests coming out from them. We will also start to frame out a procedural schedule so that we can investigate certain lines of work, schedule some additional stakeholder meetings to have conversations about what the work should look like as we drive to the July 19th/July 20th deadline for phase 1 of this process to comply with the executive order. As always, and again, none of you are that shy. Feel free to reach out to us directly if you have comments or questions about process. If there are things you want us to think about, I will always ask you to submit things that you want in the record to the record so that they can be formally considered. But we welcome the conversations. All of us at staff do. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you all for the thoughtful participation, and look forward to the engagement over the next weeks and months. So.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. Safe travels. We look forward to supporting this effort where we can, and good luck.